You won't believe what happened 3 weeks ago in the mountains of western Montana. A search and rescue helicopter crew caught footage of something that shouldn't exist. The pilot still hasn't slept properly since it happened, and the 2 trackers who were with him can barely talk about it without their hands shaking. The whole thing started on a Tuesday morning when a 28-year-old hiker failed to return from what was supposed to be a simple overnight camping trip in the Bitterroot Range. His girlfriend had dropped him off at the trailhead on Sunday afternoon, and he was supposed to call her Monday evening when he reached the road on the other side of the mountain. When Tuesday morning came and went with no word, she contacted the local sheriff's office. The missing hiker had experience in the wilderness and was well equipped with proper gear, GPS, and emergency supplies. His planned route followed established trails through a section of forest that rangers knew well. Under normal circumstances, someone with his experience shouldn't have had trouble completing the hike in the allotted time. But the area where he vanished was known for its deep ravine systems and thick forest cover that could easily disorient even experienced outdoorsmen. By Tuesday afternoon, the sheriff had organized a ground search team, but the terrain made it nearly impossible to cover effectively on foot. The forest stretched for miles in every direction, broken up by steep gorges and rocky outcroppings that could hide a person completely. After the ground team spent hours without finding any trace of the missing hiker, the decision was made to bring in helicopter support. The pilot had been flying search and rescue operations for over 15 years and had seen just about everything the mountains could throw at him. He'd pulled injured climbers off cliff faces, located lost hunters in blizzards, and found hikers who had wandered miles off trail. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for what he was about to witness. 2 experienced trackers had volunteered to join the search, both local men who knew the area better than most park rangers. They'd grown up hunting and tracking in these mountains and could read signs in the forest that others would miss completely. The pilot appreciated having them aboard because their knowledge of animal behavior and tracking skills often proved invaluable in locating missing persons. The helicopter lifted off just after noon on Tuesday, beginning a systematic search pattern over the area where the hiker was last known to be. The weather conditions were perfect for an aerial search. Clear skies, good visibility, and minimal wind. From 1,000 feet up, the pilot could see for miles across the forest canopy, looking for any signs of human activity or disturbance in the natural patterns below. For the first hour, they covered the established trail route and the immediate surrounding area. The pilot flew in careful grids, ensuring they didn't miss any section of forest where someone might be stranded or injured. The trackers scanned the ground with binoculars, looking for the bright colors of modern hiking gear that would stand out against the natural browns and greens of the forest floor. They found the hiker's campsite from the previous night relatively quickly. It was situated in a small clearing beside a creek exactly where his planned itinerary indicated it should be. From the air, everything looked normal. A properly set up tent, gear arranged in an orderly fashion, and no obvious signs of distress. But the hiker himself was nowhere to be seen. The pilot circled the campsite several times while the trackers studied the scene below. There was no indication of what direction the hiker might have gone after breaking camp that morning. The dense canopy made it impossible to see any trails or footprints from the helicopter, and the surrounding forest looked undisturbed from above. Moving beyond the campsite, they began searching in expanding circles, focusing on areas where someone might have wandered off the main trail. The trackers directed the pilot toward water sources and natural landmarks that might have attracted the hiker's attention. They checked gorges where someone could have fallen, clearings where an injured person might have tried to signal for help, and ridge lines that offered good visibility. 2 hours into the search, they were flying over a particularly remote section of forest when one of the trackers spotted something moving below. At first glance, it looked like a large grizzly walking through the trees. Grizzlies were common in this area, and seeing one wouldn't have been unusual, but something about the way it moved caught the tracker's attention, and he asked the pilot to circle back for another look. As they came around for a second pass, flying lower this time, all three men in the helicopter saw something that made no sense. The creature moving through the forest below was definitely not a grizzly. It was walking upright on two legs, moving with a purposeful stride through the thick undergrowth. Even from several hundred feet up, they could see that it was massive. Easily 8 or 9 feet tall with a powerfully built frame covered in dark brown fur. But what made their blood run cold was what the creature was carrying. Slung over its right shoulder was what unmistakably appeared to be a human body. The figure was limp and motionless, dressed in what looked like hiking clothes with a backpack still attached. Even from their altitude, the trackers could make out the bright orange color of a jacket that matched the description of what the missing hiker had been wearing. The pilot's first instinct was to radio their position to the ground teams, but the trackers urged him to follow the creature to see where it was headed. They needed to know if the hiker was still alive and what this thing planned to do with him. The creature was moving with surprising speed through terrain that would have been nearly impossible for a human to navigate, heading toward a series of rocky cliff walls on the far side of the forest. For the next 20 minutes, they tracked the creature from above as it made its way through the wilderness. The pilot had to fly carefully to avoid being detected while staying close enough to maintain visual contact through the thick canopy. Several times they nearly lost sight of it as it moved through particularly dense sections of forest. But the trackers' tracking experience helped them predict its likely path and relocated. The creature seemed to know exactly where it was going, following what appeared to be a well-traveled route through the forest. It moved with confidence across creeks, over fallen logs, and through areas of thick brush that would have stopped most people completely. The way it carried the body suggested incredible strength. It showed no signs of fatigue or difficulty despite the weight of a full-grown man and the challenging terrain. As they followed, the trackers began noticing other disturbing details through their binoculars. The forest floor along the creature's path showed signs of regular use: broken branches at unusual heights, compressed earth in areas that should have been undisturbed, and what looked like crude trail markers made from arranged stones and sticks. This thing had been using this route regularly. The creature eventually reached its destination at the base of a steep cliff wall. From above, they could see it disappear into what appeared to be a cave system carved into the rocky face. The entrance was partially hidden by overhanging vegetation, making it nearly invisible from ground level. But from their aerial vantage point, they could see that the cave entrance was much larger than it first appeared, easily big enough to accommodate the massive creature. The pilot circled the area several times, trying to get a better sense of the terrain and the cave system. The cliff walls were steep and rocky with very little vegetation except for some hardy shrubs and scattered trees growing in cracks between the stones. There were no established trails leading to this area, and it would have been nearly impossible for ground search teams to reach this location without specialized climbing equipment. After confirming the creature's location, the pilot faced a critical decision. Protocol dictated that he should immediately radio their findings to the ground search coordinators and wait for backup. But the trackers argued that time might be running out for the hiker. If he was still alive, every minute could be crucial. By the time ground teams reached this remote location, it might be too late. The debate in the helicopter was intense, but brief. The pilot was trained to prioritize safety and follow established procedures. Attempting a rescue in an unknown situation with an unidentified creature was not part of any manual he'd ever read. But the trackers pressed their case. They had experience with dangerous wildlife, they were armed, and most importantly, they might be the missing hiker's only chance for survival. The trackers pointed out that they had no idea what the creature's intentions were. It might be preparing to kill and eat the hiker, or it might have already done so. Every minute they spent waiting for backup could be the difference between life and death for the missing man. They also argued that approaching the situation with a large ground team might provoke the creature and put the hiker in even greater danger. Looking for a suitable landing spot near the cliff proved challenging. The terrain was rugged and heavily forested with very few clearings large enough to accommodate the helicopter. The pilot eventually located a small meadow about half a mile from where they'd seen the creature enter the cave. It was barely large enough for a safe landing, surrounded by tall trees that would make the approach tricky, but it was the best option available. As the pilot began his descent toward the meadow, his hands were shaking on the controls. In 15 years of search and rescue work, he had never encountered anything like this. Wild animals were unpredictable enough when cornered, but this creature was something else entirely. Its size and apparent intelligence made it potentially far more dangerous than any grizzly or mountain lion he'd dealt with before. The landing was rough but successful. The helicopter touched down in the center of the small clearing with barely 20 feet of clearance between the rotor blades and the surrounding trees. The pilot immediately began running through his post-landing checklist, but his mind was racing with doubts about what they were about to attempt. The trackers quickly gathered their equipment, rifles, ammunition, first aid supplies, rope, and radio equipment. They moved with the efficiency of men who had spent decades in the wilderness, but there was a tension in their movements that hadn't been there during routine hunting trips. They were preparing for something none of them had ever faced before. As they prepared to leave the helicopter, the pilot made it clear that he planned to stay with the aircraft. Standard procedure called for the pilot to remain with the helicopter during ground operations, and he had no training for tracking dangerous wildlife through the forest. His job was to maintain radio contact with base operations and be ready for immediate evacuation if needed. But the trackers had other ideas. They argued that they needed all the help they could get for what they were about to face. This wasn't a normal search and rescue operation, and normal procedures didn't apply. The creature they'd seen was larger and potentially more dangerous than anything they'd encountered before, and they couldn't afford to split their small team. The pilot resisted at first, explaining that leaving the helicopter unattended violated multiple safety protocols. But the trackers pressed their case with increasing urgency. They pointed out that the creature had demonstrated intelligence in its movements through the forest and its choice of shelter. They might need every advantage they could get to outthink and outmaneuver it. More importantly, they argued time was running out for the hiker. The longer they debated, the less likely it became that they would find him alive. If the creature had taken him as prey, it might already be too late. But if there was any chance the hiker was still breathing, they needed to act immediately. The pilot's fear was evident, but so was his sense of duty to the missing hiker. After several minutes of heated discussion, he made the decision that would haunt him for weeks afterward. He would accompany the trackers to the cave, but only after disabling the helicopter's engine to prevent theft and hiding the keys in a location known only to him. The half-mile trek from the landing site to the cliff wall took nearly an hour. The terrain was much more difficult to navigate on foot than it had appeared from the air. They had to work their way through thick undergrowth, across rocky creeks, and around massive fallen trees that blocked their path. The trackers took the lead, using their tracking skills to find the easiest route through the wilderness. About halfway to their destination, they picked up the creature's trail. The signs were unmistakable. Footprints in soft earth that were nearly 18 inches long and pressed deep into the ground. The depth of the impressions suggested incredible weight, far more than any known animal in the region. The footprints showed a humanoid shape with distinct toe marks, but the size was beyond anything in the scientific literature. Following the trail revealed other disturbing evidence of the creature's presence. Branches were broken at heights of 8 to 10 feet, far above where any normal animal would have caused damage. The breaks appeared to be deliberate rather than accidental, as if the creature had been marking its territory or clearing a path for easier travel. They found scratch marks on tree trunks that were unlike anything the trackers had seen before. The marks were too high and too deep to have been made by grizzlies or other known predators. Some of the scratches appeared fresh, while others looked old and weathered, suggesting the creature had been using this area for an extended period. The smell was the next thing they noticed. A strong, musky odor permeated the area around the creature's trail, unlike any animal scent the trackers were familiar with. It was organic but alien, with an intensity that suggested the creature had a powerful natural musk for marking territory or communicating with others of its kind. As they got closer to the cliff wall, they began finding more elaborate signs of the creature's presence. Crude structures made from arranged branches and stones appeared along the trail, too organized to be natural formations, but too primitive to be human construction. Some appear to be markers, while others might have served as shelters or storage areas. The most disturbing discovery was a collection of bones scattered in a small clearing about 100 yards from the cave entrance. Most were clearly from elk and other forest animals, picked clean and arranged in neat piles. But mixed among them were items that made the men's blood run cold. Fragments of clothing, a hiking boot, and what appeared to be human bone fragments weathered by time and exposure. The trackers exchanged grim looks as they examined the bone pile. This wasn't the first person the creature had taken. The evidence suggested it had been hunting humans in this area for some time, possibly years. The missing hiker they were trying to rescue might already be dead, and they might be walking into a trap. But they pressed on toward the cave, moving more cautiously now that they understood the full scope of what they were dealing with. The creature wasn't just a wild animal acting on instinct. It was an intelligent predator with established hunting patterns and a proven track record of killing humans. The cave entrance was larger than it had appeared from the helicopter, with an opening nearly 10 feet high and 15 feet wide carved into the cliff wall. The entrance was partially concealed by hanging vegetation and strategically placed rocks, making it nearly invisible from most ground-level approaches. Only someone specifically looking for it would have been likely to find it. Fresh drag marks in the dirt led directly into the cave, along with the creature's massive footprints. The tracks were so recent that some of the disturbed earth was still settling. Whatever the creature had done with the hiker, it had happened within the last few hours. The smell from inside the cave was overwhelming, a mixture of the creature's musk, decay, and something else they couldn't identify. The trackers covered their noses and mouths with cloth, but the stench was so powerful it made their eyes water. Whatever was living in this cave had been there for a long time. They could hear sounds coming from deep within the cave system, scraping noises, heavy footsteps, and what sounded almost like primitive vocalizations. The creature was definitely inside, and it appeared to be active. The sounds echoed off the cave walls, making it difficult to determine exactly how far back the tunnel system extended. The pilot hung back at the cave entrance while the trackers prepared to venture inside. His fear was paralyzing. Everything about this situation violated his training and common sense. But the trackers reminded him that the missing hiker's life depended on their actions. In the next few minutes, one of the trackers volunteered to scout ahead, while the others maintained their position near the entrance. He moved carefully into the cave, using a small flashlight to illuminate the path ahead. The tunnel sloped downward and curved to the right, disappearing into darkness beyond the range of his light. The scout returned after just a few minutes, his face pale with fear and excitement. He'd found evidence of human presence deeper in the cave: scattered camping equipment, torn clothing, and what looked like a makeshift prison area created by piling rocks to block off a small side chamber. More importantly, he'd heard a human voice calling weakly for help from somewhere deeper in the cave system. The missing hiker was alive, but his voice sounded weak and distressed. There was no time to waste on further planning or waiting for backup. They had to act immediately. The sounds of the creature's movement were getting closer to the cave entrance. It seemed to be aware of their presence and was investigating the disturbance. The trackers could hear its heavy footsteps and guttural breathing echoing through the tunnels. Whatever they were going to do, they had to do it quickly. The plan they developed was simple but dangerous. They would create a distraction to draw the creature away from the area where the hiker was being held, allowing one person to slip past and attempt a rescue. It was risky and relied on splitting their already small team, but it was the only option that gave the hiker a chance of survival. The trackers positioned themselves on opposite sides of the cave entrance, using the natural rock formations as cover. The pilot, despite his fear, agreed to help create noise and confusion by using rocks to bang on the cliff walls. The goal was to make the creature think they were a larger group attacking from multiple directions. When they began their distraction, the response from inside the cave was immediate and terrifying. A roar echoed from the depths that was unlike anything any of them had ever heard. Deeper and more powerful than a grizzly, but with an intelligence and fury that was purely human, the creature was angry, and it was coming to investigate. Heavy footsteps pounded through the cave system, getting closer to the entrance with each passing second. The trackers could see a massive shadow moving in the darkness beyond their flashlight beams. When the creature finally appeared at the cave mouth, all three men froze in terror. The creature was even larger than it had appeared from the helicopter. Standing upright, it was easily 9 feet tall with shoulders that were nearly 4 feet wide. Its entire body was covered in thick, dark brown fur, except for its face, hands, and feet, which showed leathery, dark skin underneath. Its arms were disproportionately long, reaching nearly to its knees when it stood erect. But it was the creature's face that was most disturbing. While clearly not human, it showed an intelligence and awareness that was unmistakably humanoid. Its eyes were dark and calculating, studying the three men with what appeared to be tactical assessment rather than simple animal aggression. This thing was thinking, planning, and evaluating the threat they represented. The creature didn't charge immediately as they had expected. Instead, it positioned itself defensively at the cave entrance, blocking their access while studying their positions and weapons. It made low, rumbling vocalizations that sounded almost like attempts at communication, though in no language any of them recognized. What struck all three men was how methodically the creature assessed the situation. Its dark eyes moved from one tracker to the other, taking note of their weapons, their positioning, and their body language. When one of the trackers shifted his rifle slightly, the creature's attention immediately focused on the movement. This wasn't the behavior of a mindless beast. It was evaluating threats and planning its response. The creature's posture was defensive rather than aggressive. It stood with its massive arms partially extended, creating a barrier between the men and the cave entrance, but it didn't advance or make threatening gestures. Its breathing was controlled and steady, not the rapid panting of an animal in panic or rage. Everything about its demeanor suggested intelligence and restraint. The standoff continued for several tense minutes that felt like hours. The trackers kept their rifles trained on the creature, but hesitated to fire. Despite its obvious physical threat, there was something about its behavior that suggested it might be capable of reasoning. It wasn't attacking blindly, but seemed to be trying to understand their intentions and communicate its own. The creature began making different sounds, clicks, and grunts that varied in pitch and rhythm. At first, the men thought it might be calling to others of its kind, but gradually, they realized the sounds were directed at them. The creature was trying to communicate using a complex system of vocalizations that suggested language rather than simple animal noises. When the pilot accidentally kicked a small stone, causing it to clatter across the rocky ground, the creature immediately turned toward the sound. But instead of aggressive reaction, it tilted its head in what appeared to be curiosity. It made a series of soft clicking sounds and gestured toward the stone with one massive hand, as if asking what had caused the noise. From deeper in the cave, they could hear the weak voice of the missing hiker calling for help. The sound seemed to agitate the creature, which turned toward the voice and made what sounded like warning calls. But the tone wasn't threatening. It sounded more like a parent trying to calm a frightened child. The creature looked back at the three men and made gestures toward the cave, as if trying to explain something about the person inside. The behavior was puzzling and contradicted everything they had expected. Rather than aggressive, the creature seemed protective, almost as if it was guarding the hiker rather than preparing to harm him. When the hiker's voice grew weaker, the creature showed what could only be described as concern, shifting its weight from foot to foot and making soft, worried sounds. One of the trackers tried an experiment. He slowly lowered his rifle and took a step backward away from the cave entrance. The creature's response was immediate, but not violent. It relaxed its defensive posture slightly and made what sounded like approving noises. When the tracker raised his rifle again, the creature tensed and resumed its guarding position. It was clearly responding to their threat level and adjusting its behavior accordingly. The pilot, despite his fear, began to recognize patterns in the creature's vocalizations. Certain sounds seemed to be associated with specific gestures or situations. When the creature gestured toward the cave and made low, gentle sounds, it seemed to be trying to reassure them about something. When it heard the hiker's voice and responded with clicking sounds, it appeared to be communicating with the person inside. This realization changed the dynamics of the confrontation entirely. The creature wasn't holding the hiker prisoner in the traditional sense, it was protecting him. But from what? And why wouldn't it allow them to help? The answers to these questions would have to wait because time was running out for the injured man inside the cave. During a brief lull in the standoff, when the creature turned slightly to respond to another call from the hiker, one of the trackers managed to slip around the side of the cave entrance. He moved with the stealth that came from decades of hunting experience, using the natural rock formations and shadows to conceal his movement. The creature's attention was focused on his companions, and it didn't notice the flanking maneuver. Moving carefully through the shadows, the tracker worked his way into the cave system using a route the creature couldn't see from its position. The entrance he found was narrow and partially concealed, probably a secondary opening that the creature used for ventilation or as an escape route. It required him to squeeze through a gap between two large rocks, but it provided access to the cave system without alerting the guardian at the main entrance. The rescue attempt was harrowing. The tracker had to navigate through a maze of tunnels and chambers following the sound of the hiker's voice while trying to avoid detection by the creature. The cave system was much more extensive than they had realized, with multiple levels and branches that could have hidden dozens of people. The secondary entrance led into a narrow passage that sloped downward at a steep angle. The tracker had to use his flashlight sparingly to avoid creating light that might alert the creature to his presence. The walls were smooth rock worn by years of water flow, and the floor was covered with a layer of soft earth that muffled his footsteps. As he moved deeper into the cave system, he began to understand the sophistication of the creature's domain. The tunnels weren't random formations, but appear to have been deliberately modified and improved. Loose rocks had been cleared from the pathways, and natural shelves in the rock walls had been organized with what looked like stored supplies, roots, berries, and other food items carefully arranged and preserved. The air in the caves was surprisingly fresh, suggesting a complex ventilation system that drew air from multiple surface openings. The temperature was constant and comfortable, making the cave system an ideal shelter from the harsh mountain weather. It was clear that the creature had been living here for a long time and had made significant improvements to make it suitable for long-term habitation. He found evidence of the creature's intelligence everywhere he looked. Tool marks on the walls showed where passages had been widened or smoothed. Primitive but effective drainage systems had been carved into the floors to channel water away from living areas. Even more sophisticated was a series of reflecting surfaces made from polished metal objects, probably lost or stolen items from campers that had been positioned to redirect light from the entrance deeper into the cave system. The hunter also discovered that the creature wasn't alone in the caves. Signs of other inhabitants were everywhere. Smaller footprints, different sleeping areas, and evidence of a complex social structure. Some of the footprints were much smaller, suggesting young creatures, while others showed variations in size and gait that indicated multiple adults. This wasn't a solitary monster, but a family group with an organized society. Following the sound of the hiker's voice led him through several chambers that had clearly been designated for specific purposes. One area appeared to be used for food preparation with stone tools arranged on flat rock surfaces and evidence of controlled fires. Another chamber contained what looked like sleeping areas with beds made from gathered vegetation and animal furs arranged in neat rows. Most disturbing was a chamber that appeared to be dedicated to human artifacts. Backpacks, clothing, camping equipment, and personal items were carefully arranged and sorted. Some items showed signs of age and weathering, suggesting they had been collected over many years. But rather than being destroyed or scattered, everything was organized and preserved, almost like a museum collection. The hunter finally found the missing hiker in a small chamber that had been partially sealed off with rocks and debris, but not in the way they had originally thought. The barrier wasn't designed to keep the hiker prisoner, but to protect him from the deeper parts of the cave system. It was more like a hospital room than a prison cell, with soft bedding made from gathered materials and easy access to water from a small underground stream. The hiker was conscious but badly injured. Dehydrated despite having access to water, with what appeared to be a broken leg and numerous cuts and bruises that showed signs of careful tending. Someone had cleaned and dressed his wounds using primitive but effective techniques and had been providing him with regular food and water to keep him alive. The hiker's story was even more bizarre than what they had witnessed. According to him, he had fallen into a ravine while trying to take a photograph and had injured his leg in the fall. Unable to climb out and with his cell phone damaged in the fall, he had resigned himself to waiting for rescue or death. But instead of dying, he had been found by the creature. Rather than attacking him, it had carefully lifted him out of the ravine and carried him to the cave. For the past 2 days, it had been bringing him water and food, mostly berries and roots, but enough to keep him alive. The hiker insisted that the creature had shown no intention of harming him. While it had prevented him from leaving the cave, it had also tended to his injuries as best it could and had protected him from other predators in the forest. The makeshift prison he was being held in was more like a shelter designed to keep him safe while his injuries healed. This revelation changed everything about the rescue operation. The creature wasn't a mindless predator, but an intelligent being that had been trying to help the injured hiker in the only way it knew how. The bone pile they had found outside might have been from natural deaths or other predators, not evidence of the creature's hunting activities. But regardless of its intentions, they still needed to get the hiker to proper medical care. His injuries required treatment that the creature couldn't provide, and his family needed to know he was alive. The rescue had to continue, even if it meant betraying a creature that had been trying to help. Getting the injured hiker out of the cave proved to be the most dangerous part of the entire operation. He couldn't walk on his injured leg, so the hunter had to carry him through the narrow tunnels while trying to remain silent. Every step risked alerting the creature to their presence and potentially triggering a violent reaction. The journey back through the cave system was a nightmare of careful navigation and suppressed panic. The hunter had to retrace his route through passages that seemed much narrower when carrying another person. Several times they had to stop and rest when the injured hiker's pain became too intense, risking discovery with each delay. The most terrifying moments came when they heard the creature moving through the main tunnels nearby. Its heavy footsteps would echo through the rock passages, sometimes coming close enough that they could hear its breathing and low vocalizations. During these encounters, they would freeze in whatever position they were in, barely daring to breathe until the sounds moved away. At one point, they became completely lost in the maze of passages. The hunter had been so focused on avoiding detection that he had missed a crucial turn and led them into an unfamiliar section of the cave system. With the injured hiker growing weaker and their situation becoming increasingly desperate, they had to risk using the flashlight more frequently to find their way back to the correct route. The escape became even more complicated when they triggered what appeared to be some kind of primitive alarm system. The creature had arranged loose rocks in certain passages that would clatter and fall if disturbed. When the hunter accidentally kicked one of these warning systems, the sound echoed through the caves like a gunshot, immediately alerting the creature to their presence. The response was immediate and terrifying. They could hear the creature roaring with what sounded like rage and betrayal, its heavy footsteps pounding through the main tunnels as it searched for the intruders. The sound was so close and so powerful that rock dust began falling from the ceiling, and they could feel the vibrations through the cave floor. Meanwhile, his companions at the cave entrance were running out of ways to keep the creature distracted. They could hear the commotion from inside the caves and knew that the rescue attempt had been discovered. The creature was no longer focused on them, but was moving deeper into the cave system to investigate the disturbance. Time was running out before it discovered the rescue in progress. The two remaining hunters had to make a split-second decision about whether to enter the caves to help their companion or maintain their position at the entrance. The pilot, despite his terror, volunteered to create additional noise and distraction by throwing rocks and shouting, giving the hunters the opportunity to provide backup if needed. As the creature moved deeper into the caves, its vocalizations changed from the earlier attempts at communication to sounds of pure fury. The intelligence was still there, but now it was focused on tracking down whoever had invaded its domain and threatened its protected charge. The trackers outside could hear it systematically searching the cave system, getting closer to the rescue attempt with each passing minute. The extraction took nearly 30 minutes of careful movement through the cave system, with each minute feeling like an hour. The tracker carrying the injured hiker had to rest frequently, and several times they had to hide inside chambers when they heard the creature moving nearby. The injured man remained conscious throughout the ordeal, but was clearly in severe pain from being moved, occasionally letting out small sounds of distress that they feared might give away their position. The most harrowing moment came when they were nearly at the secondary entrance and could see natural light filtering in from outside. They heard the creature approaching their hiding spot, its breathing heavy and angry as it searched for them. They pressed themselves against the cave wall in a narrow crevice, barely breathing as the massive shadow passed by their hiding place. The creature paused just feet away from where they were hidden, and they could hear it sniffing the air, trying to detect their scent. Its breathing was controlled but intense, and they could hear small sounds as it examined the passage where they had passed. For several eternal minutes, they were certain they had been discovered and were preparing for a confrontation in the confined space of the cave. But then the creature moved on, apparently satisfied that this particular passage was empty. They waited several more minutes before daring to move, and even then, they progressed with extreme caution toward the entrance. The injured hiker, despite his pain, showed remarkable self-control in remaining silent during this crucial phase of their escape. When they finally reached the cave entrance, the creature was nowhere to be seen, but they could hear it somewhere in the depths of the cave system, still searching. The other trackers quickly helped carry the injured hiker away from the cave and toward the helicopter, moving as quickly as the terrain would allow while trying to minimize noise that might alert their pursuer. But they hadn't gone more than 100 yards before they heard the creature behind them. It had discovered their deception and was pursuing them through the forest. The sounds of its approach were terrifying, crashing through the underbrush, roaring in what sounded like rage and betrayal and gaining ground despite their head start. The creature's pursuit was unlike anything they had ever experienced. It wasn't just chasing them, it was hunting them with intelligence and strategy. Instead of following their exact path, it took parallel routes through the forest that would allow it to cut them off before they reached the helicopter. They could hear it moving through the trees on both sides of their escape route, sometimes ahead of them, sometimes behind, but always getting closer. Several times during the pursuit, they caught glimpses of the massive form moving through the forest with impossible speed and agility. Despite its enormous size, it moved through the undergrowth like a shadow, barely disturbing the vegetation as it maneuvered to intercept them. The contrast between its bulk and its grace was terrifying and mesmerizing. The creature's vocalizations during the chase were complex and varied, ranging from roars of anger to what sounded almost like calls of distress. Sometimes it seemed to be trying to communicate with them, making the same clicking and grunting sounds they had heard at the cave entrance. But now those sounds carried undertones of betrayal and loss that were unmistakably emotional. The race back to the helicopter was the longest half-mile any of them had ever experienced, carrying an injured man through difficult terrain while being pursued by an enraged creature pushed all of them beyond their physical limits. The pilot, despite his fear, proved invaluable in helping to clear obstacles and navigate the route back to their landing site. Using his knowledge of the terrain from their earlier aerial survey, they could hear the creature getting closer with each passing minute. It was faster in the forest than they were, unencumbered by an injured person, and far more familiar with the terrain. Its pursuit was relentless, but also seemed calculated. It appeared to be herding them toward the helicopter rather than trying to stop them entirely, as if it wanted them to leave its territory with their rescued companion. The final sprint across the meadow to the helicopter was pure terror mixed with desperate hope. The creature emerged from the tree line just as they reached the aircraft, roaring its fury at their escape. But rather than attacking, it stopped at the edge of the clearing and watched as they loaded the injured hiker into the helicopter. In those final moments before takeoff, all of them got their clearest look at the creature. Standing in full daylight at the edge of the meadow, it was even more impressive and terrifying than they had imagined. Its massive frame was perfectly proportioned with muscle definition visible even through its thick fur. But it was the creature's face that haunted them, showing not just anger but genuine sadness and loss, as if it understood exactly what was happening and why. The creature made no attempt to attack the helicopter or prevent their escape. Instead, it stood watching them with what could only be described as resignation, occasionally making the same vocalizations they had heard earlier, but now with a tone of mourning rather than communication. It was saying goodbye to the injured human it had been protecting, and its grief was unmistakable. The pilot had never started an aircraft so quickly in his life. The engine spun up in record time, and they were airborne within minutes of reaching the helicopter. As they lifted off, all of them looked back at the meadow where the creature still stood, watching their departure with what appeared to be sadness rather than anger. The flight to the nearest hospital took 40 minutes, during which the injured hiker remained conscious and coherent. He continued to insist that the creature had saved his life and had never shown any intention of harming him. Without its intervention, he would have died in the gorge where he had fallen. The medical team at the hospital confirmed that the hiker's injuries, while serious, were not life-threatening. His broken leg would require surgery and weeks of recovery, but he would make a full recovery. More importantly, his vital signs showed that he had been adequately hydrated and nourished during his captivity, supporting his claims about the creature's care. The official report filed with the search and rescue authorities mentioned the successful recovery of the missing hiker, but provided minimal details about the circumstances of his rescue. The three men agreed to keep the full story confidential, partly to protect the creature from potential hunters or researchers, and partly because they knew no one would believe them anyway. But the pilot couldn't stop thinking about what they had witnessed. The intelligence and apparent compassion shown by the creature challenged everything he thought he knew about wildlife. It had saved a human life, cared for an injured person for days, and had ultimately allowed them to take the hiker to safety without mounting a serious attack. In the weeks following the incident, the pilot found himself returning to the area during routine flights, looking for signs of the creature or its activities. He never saw it again, but he noticed that the cave entrance had been sealed with rocks and debris, as if the creature had abandoned its home after their intrusion. The two trackers also returned to the area several times, but they found no trace of the creature's continued presence. The bone pile had been scattered, the trail markers had been removed, and the forest showed no signs of the organized activity they had observed before. It was as if the creature had vanished completely. The injured hiker recovered fully from his ordeal and returned to hiking within 6 months. But he never again ventured into the remote areas of the forest where he had encountered the creature. He spoke occasionally about his experience to close friends, always emphasizing the creature's gentle treatment and apparent intelligence. The 3 men who participated in the rescue developed a bond that went beyond their shared experience. They met regularly to discuss what they had witnessed and to debate the implications of the creature's behavior. None of them had ever encountered anything in their previous wilderness experience that prepared them for what they had seen. The pilot eventually retired from search and rescue work, citing the physical and emotional demands of the job. But those who knew him well suspected that his decision was influenced by the knowledge that he might someday encounter something similar again, and he wasn't sure he had the courage to face it. The trackers continued their activities in the forest, but avoided the area around the cliff where they had found the creature. They occasionally heard stories from other outdoorsmen about strange sounds or unusual signs in the wilderness, but they never found evidence of the creature's continued presence in the region. The incident raised questions that none of them could answer satisfactorily. Was the creature unique, or were there others like it living in remote areas of the forest? Had it learned its behavior toward humans through previous contact, or was compassion a natural part of its character? Most importantly, had they done the right thing by taking the hiker away from a creature that was trying to help him? The injured hiker's recovery was complete, and he was grateful to be reunited with his family. But he often wondered about the fate of the creature that had saved his life. He hoped it had found a new home somewhere safe from human interference where its intelligence and apparent kindness wouldn't be seen as a threat. The helicopter pilot kept the footage he had captured during the initial search, but he never shared it with anyone outside the small group involved in the rescue. The images were clear enough to prove the creature's existence, but were too precious and potentially dangerous to release to the general public. Years later, all 3 men continued to be affected by their experience. They had witnessed something that challenged their understanding of the natural world and forced them to reconsider assumptions about intelligence, compassion, and the relationship between humans and wildlife. The forest where the incident occurred remains wild and largely unexplored. Hikers and hunters still venture into its remote areas, usually without incident, but occasionally, someone reports unusual sounds or signs that suggest they are not alone in the wilderness. Whether the creature they encountered was unique or part of a larger population remains unknown, but for 3 men who witnessed its intelligence and compassion firsthand, the experience proved that the natural world still holds mysteries that science has yet to explain or understand. The missing hiker they rescued has never forgotten the creature that saved his life. Despite the fear and confusion of his captivity, he remains convinced that he encountered a being of remarkable intelligence and unexpected kindness. His story serves as a reminder that not all monsters are what they appear to be, and that sometimes the most frightening encounters can reveal the most profound truths about the world around us. You're not going to believe what happened to me last winter. I'm still not sure I believe it myself, but I've got to tell someone. My hands still shake when I think about it. I'm 72 years old, and I've been living alone in these mountains for almost 15 years now. My cabin sits about 12 miles up an old forestry road that most folks don't even know exists anymore. The county stopped maintaining it years ago, so it's just me and whoever's brave enough to drive a 4-wheel drive up here. That's usually just the mail carrier once a week, and maybe a hunter or two during season. I moved up here after my husband passed. The city got too loud, too full of memories. Up here, the only sounds are wind through the aspens, stream water running over rocks, and the occasional elk stepping through my yard. It suits me fine. I've got my vegetable garden, a few chickens, and enough firewood to last through any winter, or so I thought. October had been unusually warm that year. I remember thinking it was strange because usually by the middle of the month I'd already had my first frost. But the leaves were still green on some trees and I was still harvesting tomatoes from my garden well into November. The chickens were laying more eggs than usual, and even they seemed confused by the extended summer weather. The old-timers in town had been predicting a hard winter. They always do, but this time they seemed more serious about it. Every trip down the mountain for supplies, I'd hear the same warnings. Stock up early, get your firewood cut, make sure your roof can handle heavy snow. The kind of talk that makes you pay attention even when you've heard it all before. I'd been through plenty of mountain winters, but something about the way the weather was acting made me nervous. Animals were behaving strangely too. The squirrels were working overtime, burying nuts everywhere. Birds that should have migrated south weeks earlier were still hanging around like they couldn't decide what to do. Even my chickens were acting different, staying closer to the hen house and making more noise than usual. By late November, I'd cut and stacked more firewood than I'd ever stored before. My little root cellar was packed with preserved vegetables, canned goods, and emergency supplies. I'd even bought extra feed for the chickens and made sure my backup generator was in working order. Looking back, it's like some instinct was telling me to prepare for something bigger than a normal winter storm. The temperature drop came suddenly. On a Tuesday, it was still warm enough to work outside in a light jacket. By Wednesday morning, there was ice on the water bucket, and the weather radio was already talking about an unusual storm system forming in the west. The kind of storm they give names to and track like hurricanes. December hit us hard last year. By the third week, we'd already had more snow than most winters see total. The Weather Service kept talking about a massive storm system moving in from the west, something they were calling a once-in-a-decade event. I'd lived through plenty of bad weather, so I just did what I always do, checked my supplies, stacked extra wood by the door, and made sure the hen house was secure. But this felt different from the start. The air pressure was dropping so fast it made my ears pop. The wind patterns were wrong, too, coming from directions that usually meant tornado weather, not snow. The chickens stopped laying completely and huddled together in their hen house. Even during the day, my old bones were aching in ways they never had before. The first flakes started falling on Monday evening, tiny and hard like bits of ice. By Tuesday morning, we had 6 inches of the driest snow I'd ever seen. It didn't pack at all, just blew around like sand. The wind was constant, but not terrible yet, just steady enough to keep the snow moving and make it hard to see very far. I spent Tuesday checking on everything twice. The chickens had plenty of food and water, though they seemed agitated. The woodpile was covered and easily accessible. All my windows were secured, and I brought extra kerosene inside for the lamps. The generator was tested and ready, though I was hoping not to need it. Tuesday night, the real storm began. The storm hit on a Tuesday night. I remember because I'd been listening to the radio earlier and they were still talking about it like it might change course. But around 8, the wind started picking up, and by 9, I could barely see the hen house from my kitchen window. The transformation was incredible to watch. What had been steady but manageable wind suddenly turned into something alive and furious. The house started creaking in ways I'd never heard before, and snow began hitting the windows so hard it sounded like someone throwing handfuls of gravel at the glass. By 10, I couldn't see my own porch light from inside the house. The snow wasn't just falling anymore. It was moving horizontally, driven by winds that had to be gusting over 60 miles per hour. Trees that had stood for decades were bending like grass, and I could hear them snapping in the distance. sharp cracks that cut through the howling wind. The temperature was dropping fast too. My thermometer went from 20 degrees at sunset to below zero by midnight, and it kept falling. Even with the fire going full blast and every lamp lit, the house was getting cold. I could feel the heat being sucked right out through the walls. No matter how much wood I fed the fire, by midnight, I knew this was different. The wind wasn't just howling, it was screaming. Snow was coming down so thick, it looked like a white wall had been built right outside my windows. The temperature dropped so fast I could actually feel the cold creeping through the walls, even with the fire going strong. The power went out around 20 inches the morning. Not unusual for up here, but the timing wasn't great. I had plenty of candles and oil lamps, but the house started getting cold fast without the electric heater helping out. I threw another log on the fire and tried to get some sleep, but the noise was incredible. Trees were cracking like gunshots, and something kept banging against the side of the house. Sleep was impossible. Every few minutes, something would crash in the forest. Another tree going down, probably, and the sound would echo through the mountains like thunder. The wind was so loud it was hard to think, and the house was shaking with each gust. Around 30 inches the morning, I heard something different, a rhythmic thumping against the back wall of the house, too regular to be just debris in the wind. I grabbed a flashlight and checked every window I could safely reach, but the snow was so thick I couldn't see anything. The thumping continued for about 20 minutes, then stopped as suddenly as it had started. By dawn, the storm was still raging, but had settled into a pattern. The wind would howl for 10 or 15 minutes, then calm down to almost nothing, then pick up again even stronger than before. During the calm periods, I could hear the settling and cracking of snow and ice, the sound of a landscape being completely transformed. I managed to get the door open during one of the calmer moments and looked out at a world I didn't recognize. The snow was already 3 feet deep and still falling hard. My truck was completely buried, just a white mound where I knew it was parked. The path to the henhouse had vanished entirely, and the henhouse itself was half buried in a drift. The chickens were still alive. I could hear them clucking anxiously in their shelter, but there was no way I could get to them safely. I'd have to wait for the storm to pass and then dig them out. At least the henhouse was sturdy and well insulated. They'd be cold and scared, but they'd survive. Wednesday was worse than Tuesday night. The storm had intensified overnight, and now the snow was coming down so fast I couldn't see my own hand when I held it out in front of my face. The wind was constant, no more calm periods, just endless howling that made the house shake. I spent the day feeding the fire and checking for leaks or damage. The roof was holding, but I could hear ice building up in the gutters. A few of the windows were developing frost on the inside despite the fire. The cold was winning slowly but steadily. Around noon, the banging started again. This time it was on the front of the house near the door, rhythmic thumping like something was trying to get in. I peered through the window but couldn't see anything except swirling snow. The sound continued for hours, sometimes stopping for a while, then starting up again from a different location. I started to wonder if it was an animal, maybe an elk or moose, seeking shelter from the storm. But the sound was too purposeful, too regular. It was like something was testing the house, checking for weak points or ways inside. By evening, I was starting to worry about my supplies. I'd used more firewood than expected because of the extreme cold, and I was burning through my lamp oil faster than usual too. If the storm lasted much longer, I might have to start rationing heat. The banging stopped around sunset, but by then I was too on edge to relax. Every sound the house made had me jumping. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps on the roof. I kept checking the locks on the doors, even though I knew nothing human could be out there in this weather. Wednesday night was a test of endurance. The storm had been going for over 24 hours, and there was no sign of it slowing down. If anything, it seemed to be getting worse. The wind was so loud I couldn't hear myself think, and the cold was seeping through every crack and crevice in the walls. I pulled my mattress into the main room close to the fireplace and tried to sleep there. It was warmer than the bedroom, but still cold enough that I needed every blanket I owned. The fire had to be fed every hour, which meant I never got more than 40 or 50 minutes of sleep at a time. Around 10, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was crying. Not the wind, not tree branches rubbing together, but actual crying like a baby. But deeper, somehow more resonant. At first, I thought the storm was playing tricks on my ears, but the sound continued even during the brief moments when the wind died down. The crying seemed to be coming from outside somewhere near the house. It was faint but persistent, rising and falling like a baby's wail, but with an undertone that was definitely not human. My first thought was that it might be a wild cat or some other animal, but I'd never heard anything quite like it. I tried to ignore it and get some sleep, but the sound kept pulling at me. There was something about it that was deeply distressing, a quality that seemed to reach right into my chest and squeeze my heart. It wasn't just the cry of an animal in distress. It was the sound of something young and helpless and terrified. The second night was worse. The storm just wouldn't quit. I'd been through the routine, checked the fire, checked the windows for ice buildup, make sure nothing was leaking. I was getting ready for bed when I heard something that stopped me cold. The crying was clearer now, definitely coming from right outside the house. During a brief lull in the wind, I could hear it plainly. 3 distinct voices, all young, all in distress. The sounds they were making weren't quite like anything I'd heard before, but the emotion behind them was unmistakable. Whatever was out there was cold, scared, and probably dying. I grabbed my flashlight and heavy coat. Common sense told me to stay inside, but something about that sound pulled at me. It was the kind of crying that meant something was hurt and scared. I'd raised 3 children and helped with countless grandchildren over the years, and that instinct to respond to a baby's cry was too strong to ignore. The cold hit me like a physical blow when I opened the door. The wind tried to tear the flashlight right out of my hands, and the snow was so thick I could barely breathe. But the crying was clearer now, coming from the side of the house where the foundation meets the ground. I followed the sound, stepping carefully because the snow was already up past my knees in most places and over my waist where it had drifted. The wind kept trying to push me off balance, and several times I had to grab onto the side of the house to keep from falling. When I got around to the side of the cabin, my flashlight beam caught something dark huddled against the stone foundation. At first, I thought it was a pile of old branches or maybe some trash that had blown in during the storm. Then it moved, and I realized I was looking at something alive. There were 3 of them pressed together against the cold stone. They were small, maybe the size of 3-year-old children, but their proportions were all wrong. Their arms and legs were too long, their torsos too broad. They were covered in dark brown fur that was matted and stiff with ice crystals. But it was their faces that stopped me cold. They weren't quite human, and they weren't quite animal. Something in between. The bone structure was more human than ape, but the proportions were different. Larger eye sockets, a more pronounced brow ridge, a flatter nose. Their eyes were enormous and dark, and when they looked up at me, I saw intelligence there. Not animal intelligence, something much deeper and more complex. They were dying. I could see that right away. Their breathing was shallow and labored, their bodies shaking so violently they could barely stay upright. Ice had formed on their fur, their eyelashes, even around their nostrils. Whatever they were just babies, and they were freezing to death against my house. I didn't think about what they might be or whether they could be dangerous. All I saw were 3 small creatures that desperately needed help. The maternal instinct that had driven me outside was stronger than any fear or confusion about what I was looking at. I pulled off my heavy coat and wrapped it around all 3 of them as best I could. They didn't resist or try to run away. If anything, They seemed to understand that I was trying to help. They made soft, whimpering sounds and pressed closer to my warmth. Their small hands, and they were definitely hands with opposable thumbs and individual fingers clutching at my clothes. They were heavier than I expected, dense and solid, like children who'd been well fed. But I managed to gather them all. One was noticeably smaller than the other two, maybe a year or so younger, and it seemed weaker. The two larger ones kept making soft sounds to their smallest companion, as if trying to reassure it. Getting them inside was a struggle. The wind kept trying to push me off balance, and I couldn't see much with my arms full and my flashlight tucked under my arm. Snow was blowing directly into my face, and more than once, I had to stop and feel my way along the wall of the house to make sure I was going in the right direction. When I finally got the door open and stumbled into the relative warmth of the cabin, the difference was overwhelming. The creatures in my arms seemed to feel it immediately. Their shivering intensified at first, as if their bodies were shocked by the change in temperature, then gradually began to ease. I set them down in front of the fireplace and wrapped them in every blanket I could find. Their fur was so cold it felt like touching ice, and they were shivering so violently I was afraid they might be having some kind of seizure. I could see ice crystals everywhere on their fur, their eyelashes, around their nostrils and mouths. I built up the fire as much as I dared and moved them as close to it as possible without risking burns. They seemed to understand what fire was and didn't try to touch it, but they pressed as close as they could get and held their hands out toward the warmth. Their hands were fascinating and disturbing at the same time. They were definitely not human, but they weren't animal paws either. The fingers were longer than human fingers, with an extra joint that allowed them to bend in ways mine couldn't. The thumbs were positioned differently too, giving them a grip that looked incredibly strong and versatile. I warmed some milk on the wood stove, testing it carefully to make sure it wasn't too hot. When I offered it to them, they looked at the cup with obvious intelligence, understanding what I was offering, but uncertain whether to trust me. The largest of the three creatures reached out tentatively and touched the cup, then pulled its hand back as if testing the temperature. Finding it acceptable, it took the cup in both hands and drank slowly, watching me over the rim with those enormous, dark eyes. The middle-sized one was more hesitant. It looked back and forth between me and its largest companion, clearly wanting the warmth and nourishment, but afraid to take it. The largest one made soft sounds to it, a kind of gentle crooning that seemed to be encouragement. Finally, the middle one accepted its own cup and drank. The smallest was the most frightened, clinging to the others and refusing to take anything from me directly until its siblings coaxed it gently. I gave them small pieces of bread and some leftover stew that I warmed on the stove. They ate carefully, examining each piece of food before putting it in their mouths. Their table manners were surprisingly good. They didn't grab or snatch, and they seemed to understand the concept of sharing, with the two larger ones always making sure the smallest got its portion first. What struck me most was how they communicated with each other. They made soft sounds, not quite language, but definitely meaningful. The largest one seemed to be taking care of the other two, offering them food first, making sure they stayed close to the fire, touching them gently when they seemed frightened. They never took their eyes off me while they ate, not in an aggressive or threatening way, but with intense curiosity. They were studying me just as carefully as I was studying them, trying to figure out what I was and whether I meant them harm. When they had eaten enough to take the edge off their hunger, they huddled together near the fire and seemed to relax for the first time since I'd brought them inside. Their shivering had stopped, and their breathing was deeper and more regular. The smallest one actually fell asleep, curled between its two companions. I didn't sleep at all that first night. I kept the fire going and watched them breathe, making sure they were getting warmer and stronger. Part of me was terrified. I mean, what were these things? Where had they come from? but mostly, I just felt protective. They were so small and vulnerable, and they'd been so close to death when I found them. Around dawn, their condition had improved dramatically. They were no longer shivering, and their fur had dried out and fluffed up, making them look larger and healthier. They seemed stronger too, more alert and curious about their surroundings. The largest one got up and began exploring the cabin, moving carefully and touching things gently. It seemed particularly interested in my books, running its fingers over the covers and opening them to look at the pages. It couldn't read, obviously, but it seemed to understand that the marks on the paper meant something. The other two stayed close to the fire, but watched everything their largest companion did with interest. When the largest one found a small hand mirror on my dresser, all three of them were fascinated by their reflections. They touched the glass gently, then looked behind the mirror to see where the images were coming from. Their intelligence was undeniable. They weren't just smart animals. They were thinking, reasoning beings with curiosity and problem-solving abilities. When they encountered something they didn't understand, they didn't just react instinctively. They studied it, experimented with it, tried to figure out how it worked. Around mid-morning, they started making different sounds, softer, more musical tones that seemed to be directed at me. It took me a while to realize they were trying to communicate gratitude. The largest one kept pointing to itself, then to its companions, then to me, making gentle sounds each time. I started talking to them, keeping my voice soft and calm. They seemed to like the sound of human speech, even though they couldn't understand the words. They'd tilt their heads and listen intently, sometimes making soft responses that sounded almost like they were trying to join the conversation. The blizzard kept going for 2 more days. The wind never stopped completely, and the snow continued falling at a rate I'd never seen before. By Thursday morning, I couldn't even see the henhouse anymore. It was completely buried under a drift that had to be 8 or 9 feet deep. The creatures, I'd started thinking of them as children somehow, settled into a routine with surprising ease. They helped me tend the fire, bringing me small pieces of wood from the pile by the door. They seemed to understand that the fire was essential for warmth and life, and they were careful never to let it burn too low. They watched everything I did with intense concentration, as if they were trying to learn how human things worked. When I cooked, they stood nearby and observed every step of the process. When I read, they sat quietly and listened to the sound of my voice, sometimes making soft sounds that seemed like questions or comments. The smallest one was shyer than its companions, but it was also more affectionate. It would sit close to me while I worked on small tasks, sometimes reaching out to touch my hand or arm gently. The middle one was cautious but curious, always observing before participating. The largest one was more independent and adventurous, always exploring something new or trying to figure out how things worked. They learned incredibly quickly. By the second day, they understood basic cause and effect relationships around the cabin. They knew that wood made fire burn brighter, that fire made warmth, that warmth was good. They knew that certain sounds I made meant I was pleased with them, and others meant I wanted them to be careful. Most amazingly, they seemed to understand the concept of helping without being asked or trained. They started anticipating what I needed and trying to provide it. If I was struggling to reach something, one of them would get it for me. If I was working on a task that required multiple hands, they'd step in to assist. Their concern for each other was touching to watch. The 2 larger ones constantly checked on their smallest companion, making sure it was warm enough, fed enough, safe enough. The smallest one looked to its companions for guidance and reassurance, but also showed remarkable independence for something so young. By Thursday evening, it felt natural having them there. They'd found their places in the cabin's daily routine, and their presence was comforting rather than frightening. When I sat by the fire to read in the evening, they'd settle down nearby, the smallest one often falling asleep against my leg, while the other two listened to my voice. Friday morning, I woke up to an unusual silence. The storm hadn't stopped completely, but the wind had died down enough that I could hear individual sounds again. The settling of snow, the creaking of tree branches, the distant call of a bird that had somehow survived the blizzard. The creatures seemed to sense the change immediately. They went to the windows and looked out at the snow-covered landscape, then back at me, then at the door. For the first time since I'd brought them inside, they seemed restless, even agitated. I bundled up and went outside to assess the damage and check on the chickens. The world had been completely transformed. Snow was piled higher than my head in some places, and the familiar landmarks of my property were buried or unrecognizable. Several large trees had come down, and my usual paths were impassable. The creatures followed me to the door, but wouldn't step outside. They stood in the doorway, sniffing the air and making soft sounds to each other that seemed different from their usual communication. There was an urgency to their behavior that made me nervous, though I couldn't pinpoint why. The chickens had survived, though they were cold and traumatized. Their water had frozen solid, and they had eaten most of their emergency food supply. I spent an hour digging them out and making sure they had fresh food and water, all while the three creatures watched from the doorway with obvious concern. That's when I saw the tracks. They were enormous, at least 18 inches long and 8 inches wide at their widest point. They looked almost human, but with much longer toes and what appeared to be claw marks at the tips. The stride length was incredible too, suggesting something much taller and more powerful than any human. The tracks came from deep in the forest, wound around my house several times, then headed back into the woods in a different direction. They were fresh, made sometime after the snow had stopped falling, but before I'd come outside, something large had been checking out my property while I slept. I followed the tracks with my eyes as far as I could see into the forest. They moved in a purposeful pattern, not wandering or meandering like an animal's tracks might. Whoever or whatever had made them knew exactly where they were going and what they were looking for. The tracks went right up to my walls, under my windows, around to the exact spot where I'd found the three small creatures. Then they circled the house twice before heading back into the deep woods in a straight line. My heart started beating faster as the implications sank in. These tracks belonged to the family of the creatures I'd rescued. Parents, siblings, maybe an entire group had come looking for the missing babies. They'd found the house where their children were being sheltered, confirmed they were safe, and then retreated to wait. I looked back at the three small faces watching me from the doorway. They were making new sounds now, not quite whimpering, but not quite calling either. Their whole bodies were tense with anticipation, and they kept looking toward the woods where the tracks disappeared. The largest one came outside for the first time, stepping carefully in the deep snow, but moving with obvious purpose toward the edge of the forest. It stopped about 20 feet from the house and made a series of calls, louder than any sounds I'd heard from any of them before, carrying clearly through the still air. From somewhere deep in the woods came an answering call, low and resonant, unmistakably similar to what the young one had made, but much deeper and more powerful. The sound seemed to come from multiple directions at once, as if there were several large creatures spread out through the forest. The other two creatures joined their largest companion outside, and all three of them began making excited sounds toward the woods. They were talking to their family, I realized, letting them know they were alive and well, probably explaining what had happened to them. The sounds from the forest grew closer and more numerous. What had started as distant calls became a complex conversation involving multiple voices of different pitches and tones. Some were definitely adult voices, deep and powerful. Others sounded younger, possibly adolescents or other children. I could hear movement in the woods now, the sound of large bodies pushing through snow and undergrowth. Branches were breaking, and snow was falling from disturbed aspen boughs. Whatever was out there, there were a lot of them, and they were big. The three young creatures became more and more excited as their family approached. They were practically dancing in the snow, making joyful sounds, and gesturing toward the house, toward me, toward the woods. They seemed to be explaining their adventure, describing how they'd been rescued and cared for. Then I saw the first adult. It stepped out from behind a massive aspen tree about 50 yards away. Even at that distance, its size was overwhelming. It had to be 8 feet tall at least, with shoulders broader than any human I'd ever seen. Its body was covered in the same dark brown fur as the young ones, but there was nothing childlike about its build or bearing. It looked directly at me and went perfectly still, studying me with obvious intelligence. I felt like I was being evaluated, assessed for threat level and intent. The three young creatures ran toward it, calling out in excited voices, but the adult held up one enormous hand, and they stopped immediately. More adults appeared between the trees. I lost count after a dozen, but there were definitely more than that. They moved silently despite their size, positioning themselves in a loose circle around my property. It was clearly a coordinated effort, the kind of tactical thinking that required communication and planning. The largest one, obviously the leader of the group, stepped forward. It was even bigger than the others, maybe 9 feet tall, with scars across its chest and arms that spoke of a long and dangerous life. Its eyes were the same dark color as the young ones, but there was nothing gentle about its expression. The leader approached slowly and deliberately, each step clearly calculated. It never took its eyes off me, and I could see it was ready to react instantly if I made any threatening moves. The other adults maintained their positions in the circle, effectively surrounding me, though they kept their distance. When the leader was about 20 feet away, it stopped and made a sound I'll never forget. A deep, rumbling vocalization that seemed to come from its chest rather than its throat. It wasn't quite a growl, but it was definitely a sound of authority and power. The three young creatures responded immediately, moving to a position halfway between me and their leader. They began making rapid, excited sounds, gesturing toward me, toward the house, toward themselves. They were telling their story, I realized, explaining how they'd been caught in the storm, how I'd found them and brought them inside, how I'd fed them and kept them warm. The leader listened without interrupting, its gaze never leaving my face. I could see it processing the information, trying to understand the relationship between its children and this strange human who had sheltered them. Other adults moved closer during this explanation, close enough that I could see the intelligence in their eyes, the family resemblances between them and the young ones. Some were clearly females with slightly smaller builds and more delicate features. Others were obviously males, larger and more heavily muscled. What struck me most was how human-like their behavior was despite their non-human appearance. They stood upright naturally, used their hands expressively while communicating, and showed clear emotional responses to what the young ones were telling them. This wasn't just a group of animals. It was a family with all the complex relationships and dynamics that implied. The leader continued to study me while the young ones finished their story. When they were done, it looked back and forth between them and me several times, processing the information and coming to some kind of decision. Then something remarkable happened. One of the young creatures, the largest one that had been bravest throughout their stay, ran back to me and took my hand. It led me forward a few steps, then gestured toward its family leader while making soft musical sounds. I understood what it was doing. It was introducing me, vouching for me, making it clear that I was a friend rather than a threat. The other two joined us, taking my other hand and surrounding me while adding their own voices to the introduction. The leader's expression began to change. The wariness didn't disappear completely, but it was joined by something that might have been gratitude or respect. It looked at its children, all three obviously healthy and unharmed despite their ordeal, then back at me. Slowly, deliberately, the massive creature lowered its head toward me. It wasn't quite a bow, but it was definitely a gesture of acknowledgement and respect, understanding that I had helped its children when they needed it most. One by one, every other adult in the group did the same thing, a dozen enormous heads lowering in my direction, a moment of recognition that transcended species boundaries. It was the most profound nonverbal communication I'd ever experienced. After the moment of acknowledgement, the leader gently but firmly called its children to come forward. They looked back at me with obvious reluctance, making sounds that seemed like attempts to explain or apologize for having to leave. I knelt down in the snow and let them approach me one last time. The smallest one pressed against me briefly, making a soft sound that could only be described as affectionate. The middle one touched my shoulder gently, as if trying to offer comfort. The largest one touched my face gently with one hand, then made a complex series of sounds that felt like a thank you in any language. I tried to speak to them to let them know that caring for them had been my privilege, not my burden. I don't think they understood my words, but they seemed to understand my tone and intent. All three of them touched my hands one final time before stepping back toward their family. The leader made a low sound, and immediately the entire group began moving toward the forest. The young ones stayed close to their parents, but they kept looking back at me until the trees blocked them from view. Within minutes, they had vanished completely. The forest swallowed them up as if they had never been there at all. If not for the tracks in the snow and the memories burned into my mind, I might have convinced myself the whole thing had been a dream. The silence after they left was deafening. For 4 days, my cabin had been full of soft sounds, gentle movement, the presence of beings who were learning and growing and communicating. Now it was just me again, and the quiet felt oppressive. I spent the rest of the day in a daze going through the motions of normal activities, but unable to stop thinking about what I'd experienced. The cabin felt huge and empty without my small visitors. I kept expecting to hear their soft calls or see them bringing me pieces of wood for the fire. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying every moment of the encounter, from finding them nearly frozen to death to watching them disappear into the forest with their family. Had it really happened? The rational part of my mind insisted it must have been some kind of hallucination brought on by isolation and storm stress. But the evidence was undeniable. The blankets they'd used still smelled different, carrying a wild, outdoorsy scent that wasn't quite like any animal I knew. The cups they'd drunk from were exactly where I'd left them after washing up. And most convincingly, their tracks were still visible in the snow around the house alongside the enormous prints of their family members. I realized that I'd been changed by the experience in ways I was only beginning to understand. For 4 days, I'd been responsible for 3 beings who were entirely dependent on me for survival. I'd felt protective, maternal, connected to something larger than myself in a way I hadn't experienced since my own children were young. Over the next few days, I found myself looking for signs of my former guests. Sometimes I thought I caught glimpses of movement in the distant trees, but I was never sure if it was them or just shadows and wishful thinking. Small things around the property began to change in ways that made me wonder. My woodpile, which had been somewhat haphazardly stacked, appeared more organized when I went out to get fuel for the fire. Fallen branches that had been blocking paths were moved aside, though I hadn't touched them. Most significantly, I started finding small offerings at the edge of my property, smooth stones arranged in patterns, bundles of dried berries, pieces of bark with interesting natural designs. They appeared overnight and were always placed where I'd be sure to notice them during my daily routines. I began leaving offerings of my own, pieces of bread, fruit from my pantry, sometimes small tools, or bright objects that I thought might interest them. They were always gone by morning, though that could have been any number of forest animals. The sense of being watched wasn't frightening. It felt protective. I had the distinct impression that my property was being guarded, that something was looking out for me the way I had looked out for the 3 young ones during the storm. As winter progressed into spring, my understanding of what had happened continued to evolve. I'd encountered a family of beings that most people would consider mythological, but they were as real as the trees and mountains around me. They had intelligence, emotions, family bonds, and social structures that paralleled human society in many ways. More than that, they had demonstrated something that transcended species boundaries: the ability to recognize kindness and respond with gratitude. The brief time I'd spent caring for their young ones had created a bond that continued long after they had returned to their forest home. Spring brought new evidence of their continued presence. Wild flowers appeared in my garden in patterns too deliberate to be natural. My vegetable seedlings were protected from late frosts by carefully placed pine boughs that I hadn't put there. The hen house, which had suffered some storm damage, was mysteriously repaired one night with materials and techniques I didn't recognize. I began to understand that I was no longer just a solitary human living in the mountains. I was part of a larger community, one that included neighbors I would never see in daylight, but who were watching over me nonetheless. The thought should have been unsettling, but instead it was deeply comforting. Summer brought more subtle signs of my unseen neighbors. Paths through the forest that I used regularly were kept clear of fallen branches and debris. Dangerous areas where erosion had made footing treacherous were marked with carefully placed stones or sticks. It was as if someone was maintaining the mountains specifically for my safety and convenience. The offerings continued too, evolving with the seasons. Summer brought arrangements of berries and edible plants, always varieties I recognized as safe and nutritious. Fall brought nuts and seeds carefully sorted and cleaned. The presentation was always thoughtful, arranged in ways that showed care and consideration. I started spending more time outdoors, partly hoping for another glimpse of my mysterious neighbors, but mostly because the forest felt safer and more welcoming than it ever had before. I would sit on my porch in the evenings and sometimes hear distant sounds. Not quite voices, but not random forest noise either. Conversations, perhaps, or maybe songs. The chickens had become braver too, venturing farther from their hen house than they ever had before. It was as if they sensed the protective presence in the forest and knew they were safe from predators. Indeed, I never lost a single bird to foxes or hawks that summer, despite them ranging freely through areas where losses had been common before. When December came round again, I found myself thinking constantly about the anniversary of my encounter. A full year had passed since that incredible blizzard, since I'd found 3 small creatures dying in the snow and changed both their lives and mine forever. The winter was milder that year with regular snowfalls, but nothing approaching the ferocity of the previous year's storm. I was almost disappointed. Part of me had been hoping for another opportunity to help, another chance to demonstrate that humans could be trusted. On the exact anniversary of the night I'd found them, I heard familiar sounds outside my cabin. Not crying this time, but soft calls that I recognized immediately. I looked out the window and saw tracks in the fresh snow. Not the enormous adult prints I'd seen before, but smaller ones, young adult size perhaps, or late adolescent. I put on my coat and went outside, following the tracks to the edge of my property. There, barely visible in the moonlight, were 3 figures standing at the tree line. They were much larger than they'd been as babies, but still smaller than the adults I'd seen that day in the snow. The same 3 children, now nearly grown. They didn't approach the house, but they stood there for several minutes, occasionally making soft sounds in my direction. I had the distinct impression they were saying hello, checking on me, letting me know they were well, and hadn't forgotten what I'd done for them. I called out softly, thanking them for coming, telling them how good it was to see them again. They seemed to understand my tone, even if they couldn't comprehend my words. One of them, I thought it might be the smallest one from the year before, raised what might have been a hand in something that looked very much like a wave. The other 2 made gentle sounds that seemed like farewells. Then they melted back into the forest, leaving only their tracks and my overwhelming sense of gratitude for this brief reunion. That visit established a pattern that continued for years. Every winter, usually around the anniversary of our first meeting, I would receive some sign that they remembered. Sometimes it was tracks in the snow, sometimes distant calls. Once a small pile of pine cones arranged on my porch in a pattern that spelled out what could have been a crude attempt at letters. The protective presence never left either. I lived through several more harsh winters and difficult summers, but I never felt truly alone or endangered. Food was always supplemented by wild offerings when my own supplies ran low. Potential hazards around my property were marked or eliminated before I encountered them. My water line, which should have frozen solid during particularly cold spells, somehow never did. I began to realize that what I'd experienced wasn't just a chance encounter, it was an adoption of sorts. By saving their children, I'd become part of their extended family. The rules and obligations that govern their relationships with each other now applied to me as well. This understanding brought both comfort and responsibility. I was careful never to abuse the protection I was receiving, never to take unnecessary risks or behave in ways that might endanger my unseen guardians. I also made sure to continue offering what I could: food, simple tools, bright objects that might be useful or interesting to them. Soon, I'll have to pack up my few possessions and leave this mountain for the last time. I'll move to a small apartment in town where I can receive the medical care and daily assistance that my aging body requires. It will be comfortable and safe, but it won't be home. The life I've lived here, the relationship we've shared, has been the greatest privilege of my existence. To be trusted by beings who have every reason to fear and avoid humans. To be accepted as family by a species not my own. I can't imagine a greater honor. That's all I have to say about it. Make of it what you will. But if you're ever alone in the wilderness and you hear something calling for help, I hope you'll remember that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing the right thing even when you're terrified. For more interesting stories, check this out.
Name, Frank Miller, is what is written on the plastic bracelet clamped around my wrist. I am also told that I am unwell. I am not alone, and so are the 17 other people that were told the same when we all experienced this event. Here, in the quiet, sterile halls of the Northwood Recovery Center, we are the broken pieces of a single, impossible moment. There is the retired schoolteacher from Ohio, the young couple on their honeymoon, the college student with his headphones. We are a tour bus of strangers, now bound by a shared, unspeakable truth. We are all patients here. We are all unwell. In our group therapy sessions, the story of a terrible bus accident is recounted. We are told of a gas leak, of shared hallucinations, of minds fractured by a collective trauma. A plausible, tidy explanation is given for why 18 separate lives were shattered in the exact same way. We are encouraged to talk about the grief and the confusion, but never about what was actually seen by us. We are forbidden to speak of it, but the knowledge is passed in the silent, knowing glances across the common room. It is seen in the flinch of the young woman from Portland when a doctor mentions unidentified wildlife. It is felt in the heavy silence that falls when the word hoax is seen on the television. We were not hallucinating. We were not confused. We were witnesses. Yes, it was a giant Sasquatch dead on the road, and we are the ones who saw it. My name is Frank Miller. I am 48 years old. For 25 of those years, the life of a long-haul trucker has been lived by me. More miles have been driven by me than most people will in 10 lifetimes. Every sunrise and sunset this country has to offer has been seen by me. From the swamps of Louisiana to the peaks of the Rockies. The difference between a deer and an elk in the dead of night is known by me. The shape of a bear as it bolts across the road is known by me. What is real and what is not is known by me. I am not unwell. I am being silenced. The event called mundane by them was the night a Sasquatch was killed by me with a Peterbilt 389, while a speed of 80 miles an hour was being done down US Route 2. The fantasy they say was created by me is the truth. A truth so massive and inconvenient that a decision has been made by them to bury me along with it. Everything was taken from me that night. My truck, my phone, my career, my freedom. But one mistake was made by them. I was left with my memories, and I was left with a pen and this stack of perfectly blank, perfectly harmless paper. Writing is encouraged by my therapist, Dr. Finch. It is called narrative therapy by him. He wants my feelings, my childhood, the stress of my job to be written about by me. Every last detail. From the squeal of the tires to the smell of the blood, to the look in the eyes of the men by whom it was all cleaned up. It is not being written for him, though. It is being written for you, whoever you are. I am watched, of course. I am checked on by the orderlies every hour. What is left on the desk is read by Dr. Finch, so what is wanted by him will be given. Pages and pages about stress and loneliness on the road. But this, the real story, will be written by me at night. The pages will be hidden by me under the loose floor tile beneath my bed. How it will be gotten out of here is not known by me. But it is known by me that this story needs to be told. Because it was not just my life that was taken. Proof was taken. But before my phone was taken, something was managed by me that is not known by them. A photo was sent. Just one. It was a desperate, fumbling act in the dark, but it is thought by me that it went through. That photograph is the reason I am in here. It is the reason I cannot just be let go. I was not locked up because I am thought to be crazy. I was locked up because it is known that I am not. So let me tell you what really happened on that cold, clear night in the Cascade Mountains. Let me tell you about what is now known as the Stevens Pass incident. The night it happened was a Tuesday, October 12th. A run from Seattle to Green Bay was being made by me, and a full load of Washington apples was being hauled. It was a good run, a profitable one. Good time was being made. The air coming through my cracked open window was sharp and cold, and the smell of pine and impending winter was in it. The sky was clear, and the stars were blazing, the kind of brilliant display that is only gotten deep in the mountains, far from the city's orange glow. My route on US Route 2 was taking me east. For those by whom it is not known, that stretch of road is one of the loneliest and most beautiful in America. After the suburbs of Seattle are left behind, the highway climbs, twisting and turning its way up into the Cascade Mountains. It is a 2-lane blacktop ribbon that has been cut through millions of acres of dense, dark national forest. To your left and right, there is nothing but colossal Douglas firs and hemlocks. A solid wall of ancient trees that have stood for centuries. At night it is a different world. It is just you, your headlights, and the white lines being spooled out in front of you. An hour can be gone without another vehicle being seen. The darkness outside the reach of your high beams is absolute. That night, the road was empty. The ski resort at Stevens Pass had been passed, its empty chairlifts hanging like skeletons against the starry sky. The downhill grade was now being descended, heading towards Leavenworth. It was just after 2 a.m. My thermos of coffee was half empty. A classic rock station was being crackled softly on the radio, and the 18-wheeler was humming along, a familiar and comforting rumble. A good feeling was had by me. Alert. The road was straight for a couple of miles here. My high beams were on. A path of brilliant white light was being cut about a quarter mile ahead. My speed was steady, maybe 80, maybe a little more. The rig was heavy, and momentum was given to it by the downhill grade. It came out of the trees on my right. It was not a deer, its white tail being flicked as it leaped. It was not a bear, a low, dark shape being lumbered across the asphalt. This was different. My first impression was of size and speed. It was enormous, and it was being moved with an explosive, fluid power that had never been seen by me before. It happened in a fraction of a second, the way these things always do. One moment, there was just the empty road in my headlights. The next, a colossal, man-shaped figure was right there, caught in the full glare of my beams. It could not be processed by my brain. It was like a scene from a movie, too surreal to be real. It was upright, running on two long, powerful legs. Its body was covered in thick, dark hair, matted and shaggy. Its arms were long, being swung in a powerful, athletic stride. It was not running from me. The road was being run across by it, as if it were just an inconvenient clearing in its forest. Its head was turned to look at my truck, and its face was seen by me. It was for less than a second, but the image has been seared into my brain like a brand. It was not the face of an ape. It was not the face of a man. It was something in between, and something much older. A flat, broad nose, a heavy brow ridge. And the eyes, they were dark, and the light of my headlights was reflected by them. But underneath that reflection, a flicker of something was seen that can only be described by me as intelligence, surprise, and maybe even anger. Time was not had by me to brake. Time was not even had to swerve. At 80 miles an hour, a fully loaded semi-truck is not stopped on a dime. It is not even stopped on a football field. It is a freight train on rubber wheels. All that could be done was for the steering wheel to be gripped, my knuckles being turned white, and for the impact to be braced for. The sound was apocalyptic. A deafening, wet crunch of bone and flesh was heard, followed by the shriek of tortured metal. The entire cab of my truck was shuddered, a violent, bone-jarring jolt that I was thrown against my seatbelt by. The windshield was exploded inward, and I was showered with a galaxy of shattered safety glass. The thing's body, impossibly heavy, was thrown up onto the hood. Its massive form the grille was shattered by, and the engine compartment was crumpled by like it was made of tinfoil. The truck was veered violently to the right, the tires screaming in protest. The wheel was fought by me, trying to keep the rig on the road. But the weight was too much, the damage too severe. The truck was jackknifed, the trailer being swung around in a terrifying, unstoppable arc. I was just a passenger at that point. The world became a chaotic nightmare of sound and motion. The groan of bending steel, the roar of the engine as it was died. The sickening sound of my cargo of apples being crushed in the trailer. The truck was finally scraped to a halt, half on the road, half in the ditch. The trailer was slewed across both lanes. The highway was blocked completely by it. Silence. The sudden, ringing silence was almost as shocking as the impact. The engine was ticked as it cooled. The radio was dead. The only sound was my own ragged, desperate breathing and the frantic, panicked thumping of my heart. I was alive. I was shaking, covered in glass, but I was alive. For a moment, I just sat there, and an attempt was made to understand what had just happened. The acceptance was refused by my mind. A bear was hit by me. It had to be a bear, a massive, freakishly large grizzly bear. But it was known by me that that was a lie. Its face had been seen. Its two-legged stride had been seen. Slowly, my training and instincts were kicked in. The damage needed to be checked. Flares needed to be set out. Help needed to be called for. My seatbelt was unbuckled, my hands trembling, and the buckled door of my cab was pushed open. I was climbed down onto the cold, hard asphalt, my legs unsteady beneath me. The air was filled with the acrid smell of burnt rubber, diesel fuel, and something else. A thick, coppery, gamey smell. The smell of blood. And that's when what was left of it was seen by me. The thing that had been hit. It was lying in the middle of the road, tangled in the wreckage of my truck's front end. And the sight of it, even broken and dead, the hair on my arms was made to stand up, and a cold, primal fear was made to grip my heart. It was not a bear. It was not anything that had ever been seen by me before. And it was known by me, right then and there. The scene in my headlights was a tableau from hell. My truck was a mangled wreck, and steam was being hissed from the ruptured radiator. The asphalt was littered with shattered glass and twisted metal. And in the middle of it all, illuminated in the one remaining, flickering headlight, was the body. Roadkill has been seen by me my whole life. Deer, coyotes, raccoons. It is always a sad, messy sight. This was different. This was monumental. The sheer scale of it was hard to be comprehended. It was sprawled on its back, its limbs splayed at unnatural angles. It was easily 8, maybe 9 feet long. The body was thick, powerful, a mass of muscle and matted, dark reddish-brown hair that was now soaked in blood. A few hesitant steps were taken closer, my boots crunching on the broken glass. The gamey, musky odor was overpowering. It was the smell of a wild animal, but richer, deeper, and mixed with the sickeningly sweet smell of its lifeblood, which was being pooled in a dark, thick puddle on the road. Its legs were what were noticed first by me. They were long and powerfully muscled, shaped like a human's but on a mythic scale. One leg was horrifically broken. The bone was jutted out through the hairy skin. The feet were enormous, at least 20 inches long, with 5 distinct, man-like toes, the nails thick and yellowed like old ivory. My eyes were forced upward, past the barrel-chested torso, to the arms. They were long and ended in huge, 5-fingered hands. The hands were what truly shook me. They were not paws. They were hands, with opposable thumbs, calloused palms, and thick, dirty fingernails. One hand was clenched into a fist, as if in a final, defiant spasm. The other was open, palm up, in a strangely human gesture. My flashlight beam was trembled as it was directed towards the head. The force of the impact had been catastrophic. The skull was partially crushed on one side, but the face was mostly intact. It was the same face that had been seen by me for a split second before the crash. The heavy brow, the broad, flat nose, the wide mouth with thick, pale lips were pulled back in a death grimace, and large, yellowish teeth that were more human than ape were revealed. The eyes were open, and the starry sky was being stared at blankly by them. They were dark, deep-set, and even in death a spark of something profound, something ancient and intelligent was held by them. And an attempt was being made to process the impossible reality in front of me. A strange mix of terror, awe, and even sadness was felt by me. Something magnificent had just been killed by me. Something that had been managed to hide from the modern world. A ghost of the deep wilderness. And it had been obliterated by me with a ton of steel and a heavy foot. Then, a new thought was cut through the shock. Proof. This would never be believed by anyone. I would be called crazy. It would be said by them that a bear was hit and that my mind, rattled by the crash, had filled in the fantastic details. My phone. I was scrambled back to the cab, my movements clumsy and urgent. The inside was a wreck, but my phone had been tossed onto the passenger seat and was miraculously intact. The screen was cracked, but it was lit up when the button was pressed. A weak signal was had. 1 bar. It was enough. My hands were shaking so badly the camera could barely be operated. I was stumbled back towards the body, my heart hammering. This needed to be documented. Every angle, every detail. Pictures started to be taken. The flash, a series of frantic, desperate strobes in the darkness. A picture of the face, the dark, intelligent eyes was taken. A picture of the huge, human-like hand, its fingers curled slightly, was taken. A picture of the massive, toed foot next to my own size 12 boot for scale was taken. The difference was comical, terrifying. Wide shots of the whole scene were taken. The body, the wrecked truck, the blocked highway. Picture after picture was taken, my thumb jabbing at the screen, a paranoid fear growing in me that the phone would die, or the body would somehow vanish into thin air. After about 20 photos were taken, it was known by me that something else had to be done. The single bar of cell service was flickering. It was not known how long it would last. 911 could not just be called. What would be said? A Bigfoot has been hit, and the highway is being blocked by it? A psych eval team, not a tow truck, would be sent. My brother Dave was thought of. He lived in Spokane. He was a bit of a conspiracy nut, into all sorts of weird stuff. He would be believed by me. More importantly, it would be known by him what to do, who the pictures should be sent to. My messaging app was opened, my fingers feeling fat and clumsy. The best photo was selected, the one that the creature's face was shown most clearly by. A frantic, misspelled message was typed. Dave, call me now. Hit something huge on US 2. Need help. Send was hit. The little circle was spun, and spun, and spun. For a terrifying moment, it was thought that it would not go through. Then, the circle was turned into a tiny check mark. Delivered. A wave of relief was washed over me. It was out there. The proof was out there. Whatever happened next, I was not the only one who knew. 911 was attempted to be called then, but the call would not be connected. The single bar of service was gone. I was alone out here, on a dark, remote highway with a wrecked truck and the body of a creature from myth and legend. A decision was made to set out my emergency flares, to warn any oncoming traffic. They were grabbed from my cab, and the road was started to be walked down, away from the wreck. The night was cold and silent again, the only sound the crunch of my boots on the glass-strewn asphalt. 2 flares had been placed, and I was walking back towards my truck when the headlights were seen. They were coming from the east, the direction I had been heading. Thank God, it was thought. Help is here. A state trooper, maybe. But as the headlights got closer, it was realized that something was wrong. There were no flashing blue and red lights, and it was not one vehicle. It was 3. 3 identical black SUVs, being driven in a tight, disciplined formation. They were moved with a purpose and speed that was deeply unsettling. They were not here by accident. They were coming for me. The 3 black SUVs were pulled up and stopped about 50 yards from my wrecked truck, and the gruesome scene was illuminated in a cold, sterile glare by their headlights. They were big, heavy-duty vehicles, the kind that are used by the government, with tinted windows so dark you could not see inside. They were completely unmarked. No license plates, no government seals, nothing. Doors were opened on all 3 vehicles simultaneously, with a quiet, efficient click. Men started to get out. There were at least 8 of them. They did not look like cops. They did not look like paramedics. Simple, dark, utilitarian clothing was worn by them, like tactical pants and jackets. They were moved with a quiet, practiced professionalism that was far more intimidating than any police uniform. They did not speak to each other. They just moved, and his exact role seemed to be known by each man. I was approached by 2 of them. They were both tall, fit, with short, military-style haircuts. Their faces were grim, emotionless. "Are you the driver of this vehicle?" was asked by the first one. His voice was flat, calm, devoid of any curiosity or surprise at the carnage around him. "Yeah," was croaked by me, my voice hoarse. Something was hit. It was run out in front of me. "Are you injured?" was asked by the second man, and I was scanned up and down by his eyes, not with concern, but with cold assessment. "No, it is not thought so by me, just shaken up." The first man was nodded slowly. "The situation is being handled by us, Mr. Miller." My blood was run cold. My name was known by him. How could my name possibly be known by him? No one but my brother had been called. "My ID, who is on this road, is known by us, Frank," he said, and my first name was used now. The casual intimacy was terrifying. "You are needed to come with us. You are going to be taken somewhere safe, to be checked out." While he was talking to me, the other men were already at work. They were moved like a well-oiled machine. Some kind of portable floodlights were being set up by two of them, and the entire scene was bathed in a harsh white light. A massive, thick black canvas tarp was being unrolled by three more. Another was taking photographs, but with a professional-looking camera, and the scene was being methodically documented from every angle. It was a cleanup operation. A highly efficient, almost silent cleanup operation. "Who are you people?" was demanded by me, my fear turning to a desperate anger. "Are you feds? FBI?" A thin, humorless smile was just given to me by the man. "We are the people by whom things like this are taken care of. Now please, come with us. The area needs to be cleared." They were not asking, they were telling. I was flanked, and a firm hand was felt on my elbow, guiding me towards one of the SUVs. I was looked back at my truck, at the body of the creature that was about to be wrapped up and spirited away into the darkness, to be erased from existence. "Wait," I said, being pulled back. "My phone." Pictures were taken. There is proof. A look was exchanged by the two men. It was a fleeting, almost imperceptible glance, but it was filled with meaning. The calm expression of the first man was hardened slightly. "That phone will be needed by us, Frank," he said, his voice no longer even pretending to be friendly. "No," I said, and the phone was clutched in my pocket. "This is evidence. This is the biggest discovery in human history. People need to know." The second man was stepped in front of me, and my view of the scene was blocked. He was a big man, and his shadow was fallen over me. What was seen tonight was a large, disoriented animal. A bear, most likely. You were in an accident. You are in shock. Tricks are being played on you by your mind. It was the first lie, the beginning of the story that was being built for me. "That was no bear," I snarled. "What a bear looks like is known by me." Its face was seen. It had hands. A sigh was let out by the first man, a sound of weary impatience. "Give us the phone, Frank." I was not moved. In that moment, the phone was the only thing that made any of this real. It was my only connection to the truth. His voice was not raised. I was not threatened. He just nodded to his partner. The second man was moved with a speed that was shocking. My arm was grabbed, twisted behind my back, and I was slammed against the side of the SUV. The air was rushed out of my lungs. My face was pressed against the cold, tinted glass. Before I could even react, my pocket had been reached into, and my phone had been pulled out. It was handed to the first man, who glanced at the screen. Then it was slipped into his pocket. "This was for your own good, Frank," he said, his voice calm again. "You are going to be thanked by us for this later." I was put in the back of the SUV. The doors were locked with a heavy, final-sounding thud. Through the tinted window, the cleanup was watched as it continued. The massive, hairy body was rolled onto the black tarp by the men. It took 4 of them to do it, and they were straining with the effort. It was wrapped up tightly, being secured with thick straps, until it was just a large, anonymous black bundle. Another vehicle had arrived, a large, unmarked flatbed truck, the kind that would be used to transport heavy machinery. small, portable crane was used to hoist the tarp-wrapped body onto the back of the truck, and it was secured under another, larger tarp. It was being erased. Every last trace. I watched as something was sprayed on the asphalt where the creature had bled by a couple of the men. A fine mist from a silver canister. The dark, black pool of blood was fizzled and foamed. Then it seemed to just be dissolved, and the pavement was left clean and black. The whole operation took less than 20 minutes. They were impossibly efficient. When they were done, the road was clear, except for my wrecked truck. The creature was gone. The blood was gone. It was as if it had never happened. One of the men came to the window of the SUV and knocked. The driver, another silent, grim-faced man. It was rolled down. "The scene is sterile," the man said. "Asset is secured and en route." "What about his rig?" I was looked back at by the driver, then at the man outside. The official story is a single vehicle accident due to driver fatigue. A patch of ice was hit by him, jackknifed. The rig will be towed to a secure impound lot. It will be scrapped. Total loss. It was all planned. A story was had by them, a protocol for this. How many times had this been done before? The SUV started to move and was pulled away from the scene. And my life's work, my Peterbilt, was left a mangled wreck in a ditch. As we drove away, a standard local tow truck was seen arriving, its lights flashing. The handoff was seamless. The official world was now taking over from the shadow world. I was alone in the back of the SUV, a prisoner, my heart a cold, heavy lump in my chest. The body had been taken. My phone had been taken. It was thought by them that all the proof had been taken, but it was not known by them about the single photo that had escaped into the ether and had been sent to my brother. And it was the ride in the SUV was silent and dark. Where we were going was not known by me. We were driven for at least an hour, and the main highway was turned off onto smaller, unlit roads. We were eventually pulled up to a nondescript building that looked like a warehouse or a small factory, set back from the road and surrounded by a high chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. There were no signs, no company names, just a blank, gray, concrete building. I was led inside, not to an office, but to a small, windowless room. The walls were the same dull gray as the outside. There was a metal table and 2 chairs. It was cold. I was told to sit by one of the men who had picked me up on the highway. Then he left, and the door was locked behind him. I sat there for what was felt like an eternity. The only sound was the low hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. I was running on pure adrenaline and terror. The crash, the sight of the creature, the arrival of the cleanup crew were all being replayed in my head. This was real. This was happening. This was not some backwoods police station. This was something else entirely. Finally, the door was opened, and a different man walked in. He was older, in his 60s, with thinning gray hair and a tired, academic look. A simple tweed jacket and glasses were worn by him. He did not look like a thug or a government agent. He looked like a college professor. He was sat down across from me, and a thin file folder was placed on the table. It was not opened. "My name is Dr. Eris Thorne," he said, his voice calm and measured. "I am here to help you understand what was happened tonight, Frank." "What happened is known by me," I said, my voice hard. "A creature, a monster, was hit by me. And then your men showed up and it was stolen. And my phone was stolen." Dr. Thorne just nodded slowly, a small, sad smile on his face. "Frank, you were in a very serious accident. Your truck, a Peterbilt 389, was jackknifed after what appears to be a loss of control on a downhill grade. You are lucky to be alive. It is very common in such situations for the brain to be experienced trauma, for false narratives to be created to make sense of a chaotic event. The gaslighting had begun. It was so calm, so reasonable. It could be seen how it would work on someone who was less sure of what had been seen by them. It was not a false narrative, I insisted. It was 9 feet tall, it was covered in hair, and it had hands. Pictures are had by me. Ah, yes, the pictures, he said, and the file folder was tapped. Your phone was examined by us. The photos that were taken were inconclusive. Mostly blurry images of your wrecked truck, distorted by the flash and the shattered windshield. That is a lie, I shouted, and my fist was slammed on the table. The sound was echoed in the small room. Dr. Thorne did not flinch. Frank, memory can be affected by stress. Details that were not there can be created by it. A large black bear was hit by you. It is seen to happen on that stretch of road from time to time. Tragic, but not unheard of. The animal's body was badly damaged in the collision. In your state of shock, an attempt was made by your mind to turn it into something more significant. A story. A monster from a campfire tale. He was so good, so practiced. My reality was being twisted, and an attempt was being made to make me doubt my own eyes. Then where is the bear? I challenged him. Where is the body? Let it be seen by me. The animal had to be disposed of according to state wildlife protocols, he said smoothly. It is a public health issue. That is why the response was so swift. Teams that specialize in these kinds of highway clearances are had by us. Every answer was a neat, plausible lie, designed to seal up the truth in a concrete box. But one card was left to be played by me, my ace in the hole. I leaned forward. My voice was dropped to a low, intense whisper. All the pictures were not gotten by you. Before my phone was taken by your goons, one was sent. It was sent to my brother. The best one. The one of the face. So your story about the blurry bear is not going to work, because the truth is already out there. His face was watched closely, and a reaction was looked for. For the first time, the calm, academic facade was faltered. It was just a flicker, a tightening around his eyes, a slight compression of his lips. But it was there. A nerve had been hit. He was silent for a long moment. The file folder on the table was opened for the first time. A single piece of paper was slid across the table towards me. It was a picture of my brother, Dave, standing on his front porch, smiling. It was a recent picture. David Miller, Dr. Thorne said, his voice now cold, all pretense of kindness gone. Lives at 435 West Pine Street, Spokane. Married to a woman named Karen. 2 children, Emily and Josh. All about David is known by us, Frank. And it is known by us that a message was received from you tonight. A picture. My heart was turned to stone. He had been gotten to. This was told to us by you, Dr. Thorne continued, his voice like ice. Just now. It was confirmed. And by doing so, a very serious complication has been created. Not for us, for you, and for David. The implied threat was hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Before, you were just a man by whom something had been seen that should not have been, he said, and he was leaned back in his chair. You could have been treated, compensated for your truck, and sent on your way with a The fear that was felt was a different kind now. It was not just about me anymore. My family had been put in danger. What was done to him? I whispered. Nothing, Dr. Thorne said. Yet. David is fine. He is at home, sleeping. It is probably thought by him that your message was a prank, but he is being monitored by us. And if that photograph ever sees the light of day, David and his family will be found in a world of trouble. Audits, investigations, legal problems. Things that come out of nowhere and lives are ruined by. Is this understood? It was understood perfectly. This was how they operated, not with violence, but with the slow, crushing weight of bureaucracy and intimidation. So what happens to me? I asked, my voice hollow. Dr. Thorne stood up, and the file was closed. That is the complication, Frank. You cannot be let go now. You are a risk. A man by whom the truth is known and by whom proof is had, however tenuous, is a man who cannot be trusted. But killing you would be messy, unnecessary. Other ways to ensure silence exist. He walked to the door. You see, a man who has photographic proof of a monster is a threat. But a man by whom it is claimed that photographic proof is had, who rants about monsters and government conspiracies, and whose brother denies ever receiving such a picture, well, that man is not a threat. He is just a tragic case. A poor, crazy soul who needs to be cared for. Permanently. The door was opened, and 2 large orderlies came in. They were not the men from the highway. They were dressed in hospital scrubs. A syringe was being held by one of them. "Do not worry, Frank," Dr. Thorne said from the doorway, his face a mask of false sympathy. "Very good care is going to be taken of you. You are going to be helped to get better." A fight was attempted, but it was useless. They were strong and efficient. A sharp prick was felt in my arm, and a cold liquid was spread through my veins. My body was grown heavy, my mind fuzzy. The last thing that was seen before the darkness was swallowed me was Dr. Thorne's face, and I was being looked down at with an expression that was not pity, but triumph. The monster had not just been taken. I was being turned into one. Waking up was like being swum up from the bottom of a deep, dark ocean. My thoughts were thick and slow, my limbs heavy as lead. The first thing that I was aware of was the softness of the bed. It was not my sleeper cab bunk. It was a real bed, with clean, crisp sheets. The second thing was the light. A pale, sterile light was filtering in from a large window. My eyes were forced open. I was in a room that looked like a cross between a hospital room. A set of light blue pajamas was being worn by me, not my own clothes. On my wrist was the plastic bracelet, Frank Miller, and underneath it, a series of numbers. I was no longer a name. I was an inmate, a patient, a number. The door was opened and a woman in a nurse's uniform came in. She was smiling, a bright, professional smile that did not reach her eyes. "Good morning, Mr. Miller," she said cheerfully. "It is seen by me that you are finally awake. My name is Nurse Jacobs. How are you feeling? Where am I?" I slurred, my tongue feeling thick and clumsy. "You are at the Northwood Recovery Center," she said, her smile never wavering. "You were brought here last night after your accident. You were very agitated. Rest was needed by you." My pulse was checked, her fingers cool and efficient on my wrist. An attempt was made to sit up, but a wave of dizziness was washed over me. The drugs were still in my system. "What was given to me?" I asked. "Just a mild sedative to help you relax," she said. "Dr. Finch will be in to see you shortly. Everything will be explained by him." She left as quietly as she came, and the door was clicked softly shut behind her. I was alone again. My legs were managed to be swung over the side of the bed, and I was stood up, my body protesting. I was walked to the window and looked out. A perfectly green lawn, a few carefully planted trees, and a high brick wall were seen. It was a pretty prison. A few hours later, the door was opened again. This time, it was him. The man who was going to be my jailer. He was a tall man, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit. He had a calm, handsome face, sharp blue eyes, and a smile that was all professional charm. He looked more like a CEO than a doctor. "Frank," he said, and a hand was extended. "It is a pleasure to finally be met by you properly. I am Dr. Alistair Finch. Your care here at Northwood will be overseen by me." His hand was not taken. I was just stared at by him. He was not Dr. Thorne, the academic interrogator. This was someone different, smoother, more dangerous. His hand was withdrawn without any sign of offense, and he was sat down in the chair by the desk. His legs were crossed, the picture of relaxed authority. "It is understood that a very difficult few days have been had by you, Frank," he began, his voice a smooth, reassuring baritone. "A profound effect on the mind can be had by a traumatic event like your accident. Confusion, memory distortion, even vivid hallucinations can be caused by it. What was seen is known by me," I said, my voice low and steady. "It was determined by me not to let my fear be seen by him." "Of course you do," he said, his smile patient, condescending. "What was seen felt completely real to you. That is the nature of these episodes. A powerful narrative is created by the mind to protect itself from the raw trauma. In your case, it seems a fascinatingly detailed story involving a cryptid, a creature from American folklore, has been constructed by you. It is really quite remarkable." He spoke as if a work of fiction was being discussed, a case study in a medical journal. "My job," he continued, "is not to tell you that what was seen was not real. My job is to help you come to that conclusion on your own. Through therapy, through rest, and with the help of some medication to clear the fog of stress, you can be guided back to reality." "And what reality is that?" I asked. "The reality where you are a hard-working truck driver, by whom the wheel was unfortunately fallen asleep at, and a terrible accident was had. The reality where an elk or a patch of ice was hit, and a monster was invented by your mind under extreme duress. That is the reality where you get better, Frank. That is the reality where you eventually get to leave this place." There it was, the terms of my imprisonment. Their lie was to be accepted, and maybe, someday, I would be free. It was to be fought, and I would be here forever. A fascinating case study for Dr. Finch. "And my brother?" I asked. "The photo?" Dr. Finch's smile was tightened almost imperceptibly. "Ah, yes. Your brother David was spoken with. A very concerned man. It was confirmed by him that you have been under a great deal of stress lately. It was said by him that a message was received from you, but it was just a blurry photo of a wrecked truck. He was very worried. Your treatment here is fully supported by him. It is believed by him that it is what is best for you. He had been gotten to. He had been threatened or lied to, or both. My own family had been turned against me, and they were made unwitting accomplices in my imprisonment. The lie was complete. It was airtight. So that is it, I said, and a wave of hopelessness was washed over me. I am just supposed to be sat here until it is agreed to be crazy? Not crazy, Frank. I was corrected gently by Dr. Finch. Unwell. And the first step to getting well is for the acceptance that help is needed. He stood up, and his suit jacket was smoothed. We will be talked again tomorrow. The nurse will be in with your medication shortly. Please, cooperate with the staff. We are all here to help you. He left, and I was alone with the crushing weight of their perfect, unbreakable lie. I was walked to the window, and the brick wall was looked at. A prison for my body had not just been built. One was being built for my mind. And I was terrified. Sasquatch was seen, was gone forever, and was replaced by Frank Miller, the poor, delusional truck driver. The days at Northwood were bled into one another, a monotonous cycle of medication, therapy, and quiet observation. The drugs that were given to me were subtle. I was not turned into a zombie by them, but the sharp edges were sanded off my thoughts, and it was made harder to hold on to my anger, my certainty. I was made compliant. My daily sessions with Dr. Finch were a masterclass in psychological manipulation. I was never directly called a liar. Instead, I would be guided through my own story, and the inconsistencies, the improbabilities would be pointed out. So, Frank, he would say, being leaned back in his leather chair, this creature that was seen by you, it was 9 feet tall. How was its height determined so precisely? In the dark, after a major collision, it was seen against my truck, I would reply, my voice sounding weak even to my own ears. How tall my truck is known by me. And the hands, he would continue, and a note would be made on his pad. You were very specific about the opposable thumbs. Is it not possible that in the chaos of the moment, what was expected to be seen was seen? That the details were filled in by your mind, already primed by folklore and campfire stories? My confidence was being chipped away at, piece by piece. My own words were used against me, and my certainty was twisted into evidence of my delusion. My past was brought up, my long, lonely hours on the road, my divorce 10 years ago, the death of my father. It was all woven into his narrative. I was a lonely, stressed man, predisposed to a psychological break. The SASQUATCH was just the form my breakdown had taken. The other patients were a strange, sad collection of people. There was a woman, by whom it was believed she was a Russian princess in exile. A young man who was terrified of the color blue. An old man who was just sat in the common room all day, and a blank television screen was stared at by him. At first, it was thought they were just genuinely mentally ill people, and I was the sane man who was trapped in the asylum. But then, listening was begun. A man named Arthur was met during recreational hour in the garden. He was a former accountant from Portland, a quiet, bird-like man with nervous eyes. One day, we were sitting on a bench, and he was leaned over to me, his voice a low whisper. "Do not be convinced by them," he hissed. And I was not looked at. Whatever was seen by you, it was seen. This is done by them. It is twisted. "What was seen by you?" I whispered back. Arthur was flinched, and a look was made around to see if any orderlies were watching. I was an auditor for a big aerospace company. Something was found. A black budget project. Numbers that did not add up. Trillions of dollars, Frank, over decades. Going somewhere. Off-world. A manifest was seen. A shipping list. Strange alloys, biological samples. Things that did not make sense. He was trailed off, his eyes wide with fear. The next day, I was called in by my boss. He was worried about my stress levels. 2 men in suits came to my house. My wife was told I was having a breakdown, and then I was here. Another patient, a young woman named Sarah who mostly kept to herself, once told me in a moment of clarity that she had been a geology student. A perfectly geometric structure, miles wide, buried 1,000 feet underground, had been found by her university team using ground-penetrating radar in the deserts of New Mexico. Before their findings could be published, their funding was pulled, their data was seized, and she was committed by her family after a sudden, violent episode she could not remember. They were all here for the same reason. They were inconvenient. A truth that was not meant to be known had been stumbled upon by them. A secret SASQUATCH roadkill, a hidden space program, a buried alien city. The details were different, but the pattern was the same. Something is seen that should not be, and you end up at Northwood, where you are helped to get better by Dr. Finch and his team. We were a collection of loose ends, all neatly tied up in this quiet, comfortable prison. My fear began to change. It was no longer just the fear of the creature in the woods. It was the fear of this silent, invisible system. A machine that was designed to edit reality, to curate the truth. And it was a machine that was slowly grinding me down. The medication was making it harder for the details of that night to be remembered. The face of the creature was getting fuzzier in my mind's eye. The sound of the impact was fading. Sometimes, late at night, a sliver of doubt would creep in. What if Finch was right? What if I was just a tired, stressed-out trucker by whom a bad crash was had? What if this whole place was exactly what it claimed to be? That doubt was the most terrifying thing of all. Because if my hold on the truth was lost, if they were let to win, then I really would be crazy. And I would be trapped here forever, not by the brick walls, but by the prison that had been built inside my own skull. It was known by me that something had to be done. I had to fight back, not with my fists, but with the one thing that could not be taken from me. My story. The decision for everything to be written down was a turning point. A purpose was given to me. A secret mission within the monotonous walls of Northwood. It was a way to fight back, to preserve the truth before it was completely eroded by the drugs and Dr. Finch's therapy sessions. But I had to be smart. I could not just be sat at my desk all day and have things scribbled about. Wanted by him, had to be given. A therapy journal was started. During the day, long, rambling entries about my supposed stress would be written. The loneliness of the road, the long hours, the pressure of deadlines were written about. My failed marriage was written about, the details embellished to make it sound more traumatic. Dreams I never had, anxieties I invented were described. Pages were filled with the kind of self-pitying nonsense that I thought would be wanted to be seen by him, from a man on the verge of a breakthrough. And it worked. Dr. Finch was delighted. "This is excellent progress, Frank," would be said, the pages being tapped with his pen. "The real sources of your anxiety are beginning to be confronted by you. The layers of the delusion are being peeled back by us." It was seen by him as a sign of his success. It was seen by me as camouflage. My real writing happened at night. After the last check by the orderly at 11 p.m., a few hours of relative privacy were had. The floor tile under my bed was slightly loose. It had been carefully worked with the edge of my plastic meal spoon until it could be lifted. The space beneath was small and dusty, but it was perfect for the pages to be hidden. I had to be careful about supplies. Paper and pens were given to us freely by the orderlies, and we were encouraged to journal. But if too much was used, they might get suspicious. Only 1 or 2 extra sheets at a time started to be taken, and they were hoarded like treasure. In small, cramped handwriting, it was written to fit as much as possible onto a single page. For it all to be written down was agony, but it was also a strange kind of relief. As I was forced to recall every detail of that night, the memories became sharper again. The smell of the creature's blood, the weight of its body as my truck was hit by it, the cold, emotionless eyes of the men by whom it was cleaned up. For it to be written down was like it was being anchored in reality. It was made solid and real again in the face of their constant gaslighting. The crash was written about. The interrogation with Dr. Thorne was written about. My conversations with Arthur and Sarah and the other inconvenient truths that were hidden away in this place were written about. I was no longer just telling my story. A secret historian of the forgotten and the silenced was being become by me. The risk was immense. If I was caught, what would be done was not known. My medication might be increased until I was a drooling vegetable. I might be put in solitary confinement. Whatever it was known that it would mean the end of any hope of the truth being gotten out. There were close calls. One night, a surprise check was done by an orderly an hour after the last one. His keys were heard jangling in the hallway, and just seconds were had to shove the pages under my mattress and for sleep to be was shined into the room, the beam sweeping across my face. Then he was moved on. I lay there for an hour, not moving, until my heart rate was returned to normal. Another time, a cleaning crew came to wax the floors. I had to watch in silent terror as all the furniture was moved, their polishing machine humming right over the loose tile where my manuscript was hidden. Miraculously, it was not noticed by them. The more that was written, the more it was realized that this manuscript was more than just my story. It was my sanity. As long as it was being written by me, it was known that I was still me. Frank Miller, the man by whom something impossible was seen and who lived to tell the tale. The pages that were hidden under my floor were the real me. The man who was sat in Dr. Finch's office and his feelings were talked about was just a mask, a character that was being played in order to survive. After about 2 months, nearly 50 pages were had. A detailed chronological account of everything that had happened. The story was almost complete. Now, the hardest part came. A story was had, a weapon. But a weapon is useless if it cannot be gotten out of the cage. A way had to be found to smuggle my paper trail out into the world. And that meant someone had to be trusted. In a place that was built on lies, trust was the most dangerous gamble of all. For someone to be trusted at Northwood was like for a specific drop of water in the ocean to be found. The staff were all part of the system, either willing participants like Dr. Finch, or just people by whom their jobs were being done. Unwilling for the truth behind the pleasant facade to be seen, the other patients were too broken, too paranoid, or too deep in their own worlds to be reliable. But there was one person, a young orderly named Ben. He was different from the others. He was maybe 20 years old, and his way through college was being worked. Kind eyes and a nervous energy were had by him. The other orderlies were either bored and cynical or overly officious. Ben just seemed out of place. The hard, detached look of the others was not had by him. The patients were looked at by him with something that resembled genuine sympathy, not clinical pity. He was started to be observed. His routines, his interactions were studied. He was often on the night shift. He was quiet, and he seemed uncomfortable with the more forceful aspects of the job. He was once seen to hesitate when his medication was being roughly forced to be taken by the old man who stared at the TV by another orderly. Then had looked away, a flicker of disgust on his face. That was my opening. It had to be played carefully. My act of the recovering patient was continued. Excellent progress was being made. Participation in group therapy was started, and manufactured breakthroughs were shared. I even told Dr. Finch that it was beginning to be understood by me that the SASQUATCH was a metaphor for my own inner beast of loneliness. He was practically glowing with pride. Privileges were earned by my good behavior. One of those was access to the library. It was a small, sad room with outdated books and old magazines, but it was a place where Ben could be talked to with a little more privacy. My chance was waited for. One night, he was the only orderly in the library, and books were being reshelved. He was approached, my heart pounding. "Ben," I said quietly, "can something be asked of you?" He was looked up, startled. Sure, Frank, what is up? Is it ever felt by you that this place is wrong?" I whispered. His eyes were widened, and he immediately looked towards the door. "What is meant is not known by me," he said, his voice a little too quick. "This is a good facility. People are helped here by us. Are we?" I pressed, my voice kept low. "Or are they just helped to forget?" My eyes would not be met by him. He went back to shelving a book, his hands trembling slightly. "I just work here, man. It is a job. It is known," I said. "And it is known that you are a good kid. That is why you are being talked to. You do not belong here, Ben. A conscience is had by you." What he was doing was stopped, and he looked at me, his face a mixture of fear and curiosity. "What is wanted, Frank?" This was it, the moment of truth. "Something needs to be mailed for me," I said. "A letter, a thick one, to a journalist. No return address. Just have it be put in a mailbox a long way from here. You can be paid. Money has been saved up. It can be gotten to you by my brother." He looked horrified. "No way. That cannot be done. My job would be lost. Serious trouble could be gotten into." "You are not just going to be fired, Ben," I said, my voice cold and hard. "If it is found out, you will be ended up in a bed down the hall from me. Too much is known by you. The files have been seen. It is known by you that some of the people in here are not crazy." He was paled. The mark had been hit. Things had been seen by him. Things had been heard that did not add up. "A story has been written down," I told him. "The truth about what happened to me. Why I am really here. The truth about this place. These people need to be exposed. Help can be given by you. You can be the one by whom the whistle is blown." It was being laid on thick, and an appeal was being made to his sense of morality. But also he was subtly being reminded that he was already complicit. He was silent for a long time, and the book in his hands was just stared at. "Why should you be believed?" he finally whispered. "A story is had by everyone here, because proof is had by mine," I said. "And a picture is had to prove it. A picture that is out there, in the world. That is why they are so scared of me." A condensed version of my story was told to him. The crash, the creature, the cleanup crew, the threat against my brother. As I spoke, the doubt in his eyes was seen warring with a dawning horror. "It will be thought about," he said finally, his voice barely audible. He would not look at me. He just turned and was walked out of the library, and I was left alone with the silent, dusty books. If I had succeeded, or if my own death warrant had just been signed, was not known. For the next 2 days, I was completely avoided by Ben. My eye would not be met. I was sure I had been reported, and I was braced for the arrival of the orderlies and Dr. Finch, but nothing happened. Then, on the third night, he was on duty outside my room. As his rounds were done, a piece of paper was slipped under my door. His footsteps were waited for to fade down the hall before it was picked up. There was one sentence, scrawled in nervous handwriting. "Next Tuesday, have it be left in the library, inside the copy of Moby Dick." The week leading up to Tuesday was the longest of my life. Every day was a tightrope walk of feigned compliance and barely concealed terror. My therapy sessions were attended. My medication was taken. My empty smile was smiled. The part of the healing patient was played, all while the secret manuscript, my 50 pages of truth, was felt like a lead weight under my bed. The final pages of my story were written. Arthur and Sarah were described. Ben and my desperate plan to get this account out into the world were written about. It was written that if this story was ever read, it would mean that Ben had come through, that a flicker of decency had survived in this place. It was ended with a plea to whoever might read it. The picture is to be found. My brother, David Miller, in Spokane, is to be found. The truth was started with a roadkill, but it is ended with you. The final touch was the address. It needed to be sent to someone by whom it would be taken seriously. Someone by whom it would not just be dismissed as the ravings of a lunatic. A journalist was thought of, a guy named Marcus Thorne, no relation to the interrogator, it was prayed, by whom a controversial blog dedicated to government cover-ups and unexplained phenomena was run. He was a long shot, a fringe figure, but he was the kind of person who might just be crazy enough for me to be believed. His name and P.O. box address were written on a separate sheet of paper. On Tuesday night, my heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. It was waited until after the 11 p.m. check. The orderly on duty was not Ben, which was a relief. The manuscript was carefully retrieved from under the floor tile. The stack of pages was felt impossibly thick. It was slipped, along with the address, inside the large manila envelope that had been managed to be snagged from the library's supply closet. Then the hard part came. I had to get to the library. My good behavior meant my door was not always locked at night, a privilege that was given to patients who were deemed low risk. The door was cracked open and I peered out. The hallway was empty, cast in the dim, humming glow of the overhead nightlights. I was moved as silently as I could, my bare feet padding on the cold linoleum floor. Every creak of the building, every distant cough, a jolt of ice was sent through my veins. The library was at the far end of the hall. It felt like a mile away. I was slipped inside, the door being whispered shut behind me. The room smelled of old paper and dust. The literature section was quickly found, my hands scanning the spines in the dim light. Melville. Moby Dick. The heavy book was pulled from the shelf. My hands were shaking as it was opened and the manila envelope was placed inside. It fit perfectly. The book was pushed back into its place on the shelf, the manuscript now hidden in plain sight. My part was done. It was all up to Ben now. I was crept back to my room, my body awash with a strange mixture of terror and relief. It had been done. I had fought back. Whatever happened next, I had not gone down silently. I was gotten back into bed, but it was known that sleep would not come. I just lay there, the ceiling being stared at, the quiet hum of the building being listened to. The creature was thought about, its dark, intelligent eyes staring into my headlights in its last moments of life. The cold efficiency of the men by whom it had been erased from the world was thought about. They were so powerful, their conspiracy so vast. What was my little stack of paper against all of that? It was a fool's hope, maybe, but it was the only hope I had. I must have been drifted off at some point because I was jolted awake by a sound that was not part of the building's usual nightly groans. It was the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. More than one person. They were moving with a purpose. They were stopped outside my door. I was sat bolt upright in bed, my blood turning to ice. This was not a routine check. This was wrong. Silence. Then, a new sound. The jangle of keys, different from the orderly's keys. This was heavier, more official. Followed by the sharp, metallic sound of a key being slid into the lock of my door. They know. My eyes were darted around the small, white room. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The hunt for truth was felt the same. The lock was turned with a heavy, final click. This is where my story is ended, for now. Who is on the other side of that door is not known. Maybe it is Ben, caught and forced for me to be betrayed. Maybe it is Dr. Finch, his charming smile gone, ready for my treatment to be escalated. Or maybe it is someone who has not yet been met. Someone from even higher up the chain of command. If this manuscript will ever leave the library is not known. If Ben will make it out is not known. But it has to be believed that he will. It has to be believed that this story, my truth, will find its way to you. My name is Frank Miller.